She was dragged toward the riverbank until the cowboy rode down and shot the rope from their hands. This is the story of Lydia Carter, a woman who survived the unthinkable and found redemption in the arms of a man who refused to let evil win. It's a tale of bullets and broken hearts, of second chances carved from the Montana wilderness. Stay with me until the very end and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels across the world. The morning Lydia Carter should have died began with the scream of a hawk and ended with the crack of a rifle that split the sky in two. Montana Territory stretched wild and unforgiving in the summer of 1878, a land where the Snake River churned white and violent through canyons older than memory, where the sun beat down on sagebrush and stone with a merciless indifference that separated the living from the soon-to-be dead. The territory belonged to those strong enough to claim it, cattlemen with sun-worn faces, prospectors chasing fool's gold into the mountains, and outlaws who'd learned that the distance between law and lawlessness was measured in days of hard riding. Lydia had learned this truth 3 days earlier when the stagecoach carrying her from Fort Benton to Silver Creek had lurched to a stop on a desolate stretch of road, and 6 men with bandanas covering their faces had materialized from the rocks like demons summoned from hell itself. She remembered every detail with the terrible clarity of trauma. The driver, a gray-bearded man named Hutchins who'd told jokes about his grandchildren, had reached for his shotgun. The bullet that killed him arrived before his fingers touched the stock. The sound was flat and final, and then he was toppling sideways, and one of the passengers, a mining engineer from Philadelphia, was screaming about his company's payroll. The outlaws didn't care about screaming. They cared about gold and paper money and pocket watches and anything else that glittered or folded. They moved through the stagecoach like locusts through wheat, efficient and thorough. And when the mining engineer tried to hide his company documents in his boot, they shot him twice in the chest and took the papers anyway. Lydia had pressed herself into the corner of the coach, her traveling dress soaked with someone else's blood, her breath coming in shallow gasps that tasted of copper and fear. There were 7 passengers when the day started. By the time the outlaws finished, there were 2, herself and a cattle buyer named Morrison, who'd frozen with his hands up and his eyes squeezed shut, praying in whispered German. The leader of the gang was a man they called Mason. Lydia would learn his full name later, Garrett Mason, wanted in 3 territories for murder, robbery, and crimes the wanted posters didn't have words for. He was tall and angular, with black hair that hung to his shoulders and eyes the color of river stones, flat, dead, empty of anything human. He'd looked at Lydia the way a man looks at livestock at auction, calculating value and utility, and then he'd smiled, and that smile contained more threat than any gun. "Well now," he'd said, his voice smooth as whiskey. "What do we have here?" She'd tried to speak, tried to plead, but her throat had closed like a fist and no sound emerged. Mason had laughed at that, a low chuckle that made the other men grin behind their bandanas. He'd reached into the coach and pulled her out by her wrist, his grip iron strong. And when Morrison made a small sound of protest, one of the other outlaws had shot him through the temple without breaking stride and looting the luggage. "You're coming with us, sweetheart," Mason had said, and Lydia's world had collapsed into a single point of terror, so pure it felt like drowning. That was 3 days ago. 3 days of riding tied behind one of the outlaws' horses, wrists bound so tight the rope cut through her gloves and into her skin. 3 days of sleeping on bare ground with no blanket, of eating nothing but hardtack thrown at her feet like she was a dog. 3 days of Mason's eyes on her every time she looked up, calculating, waiting, playing some game only he understood the rules to. The gang moved through the territory like smoke, never staying anywhere long enough to leave tracks. They'd hit the stagecoach on the Clearwater Road, then ridden north through terrain so rough Lydia lost all sense of direction. She heard them talking around the campfire at night, about banks they'd robbed in Colorado, about a marshal they'd killed in Wyoming, about how much money was waiting in the mining camps if a man was smart and fast enough to take it. On the second night, Mason had crouched beside her, so close she could smell whiskey and tobacco on his breath. "You're wondering why you're still alive," he'd said quietly, almost conversationally. "You're thinking maybe we need you for something, maybe ransom, maybe you're somebody important's daughter." He'd smiled that terrible smile. Truth is, darling, I just haven't decided what to do with you yet. I like to take my time with decisions, especially the permanent ones. She'd understood then, with crystalline certainty, that she was going to die. The only question was when, and how much she'd suffer first. The third morning, the morning that should have been her last, dawned cold and clear, with frost on the ground that crunched under the horses' hooves. They were following the Snake River through a canyon where the walls rose steep on both sides, and the water roared like a living thing, angry and hungry. The trail was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 horses abreast, and the drop to the river was 40 feet of empty air ending in white water that would smash a body to pieces against the rocks. Mason had reined in his horse at a wide spot where a sandbank jutted into the river. The water here was marginally calmer, flowing around a bend where cottonwoods grew thick on the far side. He dismounted and stood looking at the river for a long moment, then turned to Lydia with that calculating expression she'd learned to dread. "End of the line, sweetheart," he'd said. The words hit her like a physical blow. She'd known it was coming, had felt it approaching like a storm on the horizon, but the reality of it, the absolute finality, made her legs nearly buckle. "Please," she'd whispered, finding her voice at last. "Please, I haven't done anything. I won't tell anyone. I'll disappear. You'll never see me again." Mason had shaken his head slowly, almost regretfully. "Can't take that chance. You've seen our faces, you know our names. That's a loose end, and I don't leave loose ends." 2 of his men, brothers named Cobb and Pike, faces hard as the territory that spawned them, had grabbed her arms and started dragging her toward the water. She'd fought then, finding some reserve of strength she didn't know she possessed, twisting and kicking and screaming, but they were too strong and she was too weak from days without food or water. "Make it quick," Mason had said, lighting a cigarette. "Drown her and let's move on. We've got a bank in Elk Ridge that's not going to rob itself." The water was shockingly cold when they pulled her into it up to her knees, the current strong enough that she had to fight to keep her footing. Cobb was laughing, a high, unpleasant sound that spoke of too many similar moments in his past. Pike was silent, methodical, pulling rope from his saddle to weight her down. "Any last words?" Cobb asked, grinning with brown teeth. Lydia looked at him, at Mason smoking calmly on the bank, at the other 3 gang members watching with the bored interest of men who'd seen this performance before. She thought about her mother, dead 5 years from fever. She thought about her father, who'd drunk himself to death the following winter. She thought about the teaching position waiting for her in Silver Creek, the little schoolhouse she'd never see, the children she'd never teach to read. "Go to hell," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her limbs. Cobb's grin widened. "Ladies first." He pushed her backward. She went under, the cold shocking the breath from her lungs, the current immediately grabbing at her skirts and pulling her toward deeper water. She fought to the surface, gasping, her bound hands making it impossible to swim properly. The rope around her wrists was tied to Pike's saddle, and now he was backing his horse away from the water, dragging her inexorably toward the main channel where the current ran fastest. She could see the rocks downstream, black and jagged, waiting. She could feel the rope cutting deeper into her wrists, feel her strength failing, feel the water filling her boots and pulling her down. This was how it ended then. Drowned in a river whose name she didn't know, her body food for fish, her death unmourned and unavenged. She'd be listed as missing, one more name in a territory full of people who'd simply disappeared, swallowed by distance and violence and the vast indifference of the wild. She stopped fighting and let the water take her. And that's when the rifle shot cracked across the canyon like the voice of God. The sound was enormous, echoing off the rock walls, and for a heartbeat, everything stopped. The river, the outlaws, time itself seemed to pause. Then Pike was screaming because the rope tied to his saddle had suddenly gone slack, severed clean through by a bullet so precisely aimed it might have been guided by divine intervention. Lydia's hands separated as the rope fell away. She surfaced, coughing and gasping, barely able to process what had happened. On the bank, the outlaws were scattering, diving for cover, grabbing for weapons, shouting in confusion and alarm. Another shot rang out, and Cobb went down hard, clutching his shoulder, his revolver spinning away into the rocks. A third shot kicked up dirt 6 inches from Mason's boots, sending him scrambling behind his horse. "Who's shooting? Where are they?" Mason was shouting, his smooth composure shattered. The answer came from the ridge above the trail, where a figure on horseback was descending at a controlled run, picking his way down the steep slope with the confidence of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. He was tall, Lydia could see that even from a distance, wearing a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, a rifle held in one hand with the casual ease of someone born to it. He fired again as he rode, not from the hip like in dime novels, but from the shoulder, the rifle coming up smooth and steady, and one of the outlaws who'd been raising his own weapon suddenly jerked backward and fell. "Christ, he's on top of us!" Pike yelled, abandoning any thought of fighting and spurring his horse into a panicked gallop up the trail. Two other gang members followed, their horses' hooves striking sparks from the rocks as they fled. Mason stood his ground for a moment longer, his revolver out, searching for a target. The rider had reached the trail now, and he was closer than Mason had thought. Close enough that Lydia could see his face beneath the hat brim, weathered and hard-angled, with eyes the pale blue of winter ice. "Drop it," the rider said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. He'd reined in his horse, a big buckskin gelding with intelligent eyes, and now sat calmly with the rifle pointed at Mason's chest. For a moment, Lydia thought Mason would try it anyway. She could see the calculation in his eyes, weighing odds, measuring distances. Then he must have seen something in the rider's expression, some quality of competence or lethality or simple readiness, because he slowly lowered his revolver and let it fall to the ground. "Smart," the rider said. He swung down from his horse with fluid grace, never letting the rifle waver. "On your knees." Mason knelt, his jaw tight with rage and humiliation. The rider moved past him without a second glance, his attention now on the river where Lydia was still struggling to keep her head above water, the current pulling at her sodden dress. He handed the rifle to his left hand and drew a Colt revolver with his right, all in one smooth motion, and fired a single shot. The bullet struck the bank 6 inches from Mason's head, showering him with dirt and gravel. "Stay put," the rider said mildly. "I won't ask twice." Then he was striding into the water, seemingly unconcerned about the cold or the current, moving with purposeful speed toward Lydia. She tried to call out, to warn him about the depth and the undertow, but her voice was gone, lost to exhaustion and terror and the water she'd swallowed. He reached her just as her strength finally failed completely. His hands caught her under the arms, strong hands, calloused and sure, and then he was lifting her bodily from the river like she weighed nothing at all. She collapsed against his chest, coughing and shaking, and he half carried, half dragged her back to the bank and set her down gently on the sand. "Easy now," he said quietly, his voice close to her ear. "You're safe. Just breathe." Safe. The word sounded like a foreign language, something from another lifetime. She looked up at him through vision blurred by river water and tears, trying to focus on his face. He had a scar along his jaw, old and white, and lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into distance. His hair was dark brown, sun-streaked at the temples, and when he looked at her, his expression held something she hadn't seen in 3 days, concern for another human being. "Can you talk?" he asked. She nodded, then immediately started coughing again, her whole body convulsing. He supported her through it, one hand on her back, patient and steady, until the spasms passed. "My name's Caleb Reeves," he said when she could breathe again. "I'm a bounty hunter. I've been tracking these men for 2 weeks. He produced a knife from his boot and cut the remains of the rope from her wrists with swift, efficient movements. The sudden absence of pressure made her gasp. The rope had cut so deep she hadn't realized how numb her hands had become. "Your wrists are a mess," Caleb said, examining them with a frown. "We'll need to clean these properly or they'll infect." He pulled a canteen from his belt and offered it to her. "Small sips, not too fast." The water was clean and cold and tasted better than anything she'd ever consumed. She drank greedily despite his warning, and he didn't try to stop her. When she finally lowered the canteen, she found her voice. "Thank you," she whispered. I was certain." "I know," he said simply. There was no judgment in his tone, no false comfort, just acknowledgement of the terrible truth they both understood. A groan from the sandbank reminded them they weren't alone. Cobb was still there, curled on his side, clutching his wounded shoulder and moaning. Mason remained on his knees, his expression murderous, watching Caleb with the kind of hatred that promised retribution if he ever got the chance. Caleb stood and walked over to Mason, moving with the relaxed confidence of a man completely in control of his situation. He pulled a pair of iron handcuffs from his coat pocket and snapped them around Mason's wrists with practiced efficiency. "Garrett Mason," he said, "there's $500 on your head, dead or alive. You're wanted for murder in Colorado, armed robbery in Wyoming, and about 6 other things in Montana. You're going to hang, and it's going to be soon." Mason smiled, showing his teeth. "You won't get me to a marshal. My boys will come back for me. They always do." "Your boys are halfway to Canada by now," Caleb said. "Men like that don't risk their necks for anyone. You should know that. You taught them." The smile faded from Mason's face. Caleb turned his attention to Cobb, who'd gone pale from blood loss. The shoulder wound was bleeding steadily, staining the sand dark red. Caleb crouched beside him and examined the injury with the detachment of someone who'd seen plenty of gunshot wounds before. "Bullet went clean through," he said. "You'll live, assuming you don't do anything stupid." He pulled a strip of cloth from his saddlebag and bound the wound tight enough to slow the bleeding. Cobb whimpered but didn't fight him. "What about the others?" Lydia asked, her voice still rough. "The ones who ran." "I'll track them down eventually," Caleb said, "but right now, getting you somewhere safe is more important." He helped her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed. "Can you ride?" She nodded, though in truth she wasn't sure. Her legs felt like water. Her vision kept going gray at the edges, and the adrenaline that had kept her functioning was rapidly deserting her, leaving behind bone-deep exhaustion. Caleb seemed to read her condition accurately. "We'll take it slow," he said. He retrieved his rifle and whistled sharply. The buckskin gelding trotted over immediately, followed by one of the outlaw's horses, a gray mare with a nervous temperament. "This one belonged to Pike," Caleb said, running a hand down the mare's neck to calm her. "She's skittish but sound. Think you can manage her?" "I can ride," Lydia said, with more confidence than she felt. He helped her into the saddle, his hand steadying her when she nearly fell the first time. The world tilted sickeningly, and for a moment she thought she might pass out, but she locked her knees against the stirrups and forced herself to stay conscious through sheer will. Caleb mounted his own horse and looked at his 2 prisoners. Mason was glaring at him with undiluted venom. Cobb had curled into a ball and seemed to have passed out from pain or shock or both. "Problem," Caleb said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Can't take them both and keep you safe. And I can't leave them here. They'll be gone or dead by morning." He thought for a moment, his expression distant, calculating odds and risks. Then he pulled a length of rope from his saddle and began tying Mason to a cottonwood tree, binding him so thoroughly there was no possibility of escape. "You can't leave me here," Mason shouted, real fear entering his voice for the first time. "Those mountains have wolves, bears. I'll be eaten alive." "Should have thought of that before you decided to drown an innocent woman," Caleb said without sympathy. He tied the last knot and tested it, then moved to Cobb and dragged him over to the same tree, propping him up against the trunk and securing him alongside Mason. "Listen carefully," Caleb said, his voice flat and hard. "I'm going to ride this young lady somewhere safe, get her cleaned up and fed, and then I'm going to ride to Elk Ridge and send the marshal back here to collect you. That's about 18 hours if I push hard. If you're lucky, the marshal will arrive before anything else does. If you're not lucky," he shrugged. "Well, I guess that's between you and your maker." "You bastard!" Mason hissed. "This is murder." "No," Caleb said. "Murder is what you did to those people on the stagecoach. This is called consequences." He turned away from them and swung back onto his horse. "Come on, miss. We're burning daylight." Lydia followed him up the trail, away from the river and the 2 men tied to the tree and the nightmare of the past 3 days. She looked back once and saw Mason straining against the ropes, his face contorted with rage and fear, and felt absolutely nothing, no pity, no satisfaction, just a vast emptiness where her emotions should have been. They rode in silence for the first hour, following a game trail that wound through dense stands of pine and aspen. The sun climbed higher, warming the air. But Lydia couldn't stop shivering. She'd lost her coat somewhere in the river, and her dress was still soaked, clinging to her skin like a second, colder layer. Caleb noticed. He reined in and shrugged out of his own coat, a heavy oilcloth duster that smelled of leather and gunpowder, and handed it to her without a word. She took it gratefully and wrapped it around herself, and the warmth was like a physical blessing. "Thank you," she said again. It seemed like the only words she knew anymore. "You keep saying that," Caleb said, but there was no reproach in his tone. He urged his horse forward again, and she followed. The second hour passed in a blur of exhaustion and residual fear. Every sound made her jump. The snap of a branch, the cry of a bird, the rustle of wind through leaves. She kept expecting Mason and his men to come riding out of the trees, guns blazing, unstoppable. The rational part of her mind knew they were tied up and helpless, but trauma doesn't answer to reason. Caleb must have sensed her state because he started talking, his voice low and steady, filling the silence with something other than her racing thoughts. "I've been tracking the Mason gang for 16 days, he said. "Started down in Billings after they robbed a bank and killed the clerk. Young kid, maybe 19, shot him just for being in the way. That's when the bounty went up to $500. The bank added another $200 on top of the territorial reward." $700, Lydia said numbly. It was more money than she'd see in 3 years of teaching. "Good money," Caleb agreed. "But that's not really why I'm doing this. Mason killed a friend of mine 2 years ago, a man named Joshua Brennan. We worked together hunting buffalo up in Wyoming. Josh was a good man, had a wife and 2 daughters. Mason shot him over a poker game, claimed Josh was cheating." He paused. "Josh couldn't cheat if his life depended on it. He was just winning honest, and Mason didn't like it." "I'm sorry," Lydia said. "Me too." Caleb was quiet for a moment, then continued. "I went to Josh's funeral, saw his wife and those little girls crying like their world had ended, which it had. Made a promise to Josh's grave that I'd bring Mason to justice. Took me 2 years to pick up his trail. I've come too close to let him slip away now." "Do you always keep your promises?" Lydia asked. He glanced back at her, and something in his ice-blue eyes made her breath catch. "Always," he said. By the 3rd hour, the trail had widened into something resembling a proper road. They passed a burned-out homestead, the chimney standing like a tombstone among charred timbers, and Caleb's expression darkened. "Raiders," he said shortly. "This territory's full of them. Men who came west looking for gold or land and found out the reality was harder than the dream. Some of them turned mean." He gestured at the ruins. "Family named Henderson lived here. Good people. They left last year, moved back east. Couldn't take it anymore." The sun was past its zenith when they finally stopped beside a creek that ran clear and cold over smooth stones. Caleb dismounted and helped Lydia down, catching her when her legs buckled beneath her. "Easy," he said. "Let's get you sitting down." He guided her to a fallen log and made her drink more water from his canteen. Then he knelt beside the creek and wet a clean cloth, which he used to gently clean the rope burns on her wrists. The water stung fiercely, and she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. "Sorry," Caleb said, his touch as gentle as he could make it. "These need proper care or they'll suppurate. Have you got any other injuries?" She shook her head, then reconsidered. "Bruises. They hit me a few times. Nothing serious." His jaw tightened, but he didn't comment. He finished cleaning her wrists and bound them with strips of cloth torn from what appeared to be a spare shirt from his saddlebag. The bindings were neat and professional, and when he was done, the throbbing pain had lessened slightly. "You've done this before," Lydia observed. "Been hurt before," Caleb corrected. "When you spend enough time getting shot at, you learn basic doctoring." He sat back on his heels and studied her face. "What's your name? I realized I've been calling you Miss because I never asked." "Lydia Carter," she said. "I was traveling to Silver Creek. There's a teaching position waiting for me there. Was waiting. I don't know if they'll still hold it after—" She gestured vaguely, encompassing the stagecoach robbery, the murders, her 3-day captivity. "They'll wait," Caleb said firmly. "Once word gets out what happened, and it will, they'll understand. Whole territory will be talking about it. Mason's gang has been terrorizing this region for months. You're not the first person they've hurt." "But I'm the first one to survive," Lydia said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Caleb didn't deny it. "Yes," he said finally. "You are." And that makes you incredibly brave or incredibly lucky, and I suspect it's a measure of both. I don't feel brave, Lydia said. Her voice cracked slightly. I feel like I'm going to shatter into 1,000 pieces and never be put back together again. Caleb was silent for a long moment. Then he said, 3 years ago, I got bushwhacked by claim jumpers up near Helena. They shot me twice, once in the chest and once in the leg, and left me for dead in a ravine. I laid there for a day and a half, bleeding, thinking I was finished. A trapper found me purely by accident. His dog smelled the blood and came investigating. He touched the scar on his jaw. Took me 4 months to recover. Another month before I could walk without a cane. I spent that whole time feeling exactly like you described, shattered, broken in ways I couldn't see or name. Thought I'd never be whole again. What changed? Lydia asked. Time, he said, and stubbornness, and waking up one morning and realizing I had a choice. I could let what happened to me define the rest of my life, or I could define it myself. He met her eyes. You've got the same choice ahead of you, Lydia. Right now it doesn't feel like it. Right now you're just trying to survive the next hour, and that's fine. That's how it works. But eventually you'll get to choose who you want to be in the aftermath. And my guess is you'll choose strong. Something in his words cracked the shell of numbness she'd been hiding inside. She felt tears welling up, and then she was crying, really crying, for the first time since the stagecoach robbery. All the fear and grief and rage she'd been holding back came pouring out in great, racking sobs that shook her entire body. Caleb didn't try to stop her or comfort her with empty words. He simply moved to sit beside her on the log, close enough that she could feel his solid presence, and let her cry until she had nothing left. When the storm finally passed, she felt hollowed out but somehow cleaner, like a wound that had been lanced and drained. I'm sorry, she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Don't be, Caleb said. You're entitled to cry after what you've been through. Hell, I'd be worried if you didn't. They sat by the creek for a while longer, listening to the water and the wind in the pines. The sun was declining now, shadows lengthening across the ground. Caleb finally stood and stretched, his joints popping. We need to keep moving, he said. There's a settlement about 2 hours north of here, a place called Prospect. They've got a doctor and a telegraph office. We'll get you looked at properly, and I'll wire ahead to the marshal in Elk Ridge about Mason and his friend. What about Silver Creek? Lydia asked. That's where I was supposed to be going. Silver Creek's 3 days' ride east, Caleb said. You're in no condition for that kind of journey yet. Let's get you to Prospect first, make sure you're healing proper, and then we'll figure out the next step. She wanted to argue, to insist she was fine, but the truth was she could barely stand without swaying. The idea of 3 more days in the saddle felt impossible. All right, she said. Prospect it is. They mounted up again and continued north, following the road as it climbed into higher country. The landscape changed around them. Fewer pines, more open meadows where the grass grew tall and golden in the afternoon light. They passed a herd of elk grazing near a spring, the animals lifting their heads to watch the riders pass with wary eyes. This territory used to be nothing but buffalo, Caleb said, breaking the companionable silence. When I first came out here 10 years ago, you could ride for days and see nothing but herds stretching to the horizon. Now, he shook his head. Now there's maybe a few thousand left scattered in the mountains. Hunters killed most of them, took the hides and left the meat to rot. That's terrible, Lydia said. That's progress, Caleb said, and there was bitter irony in his voice. Or what passes for it out here. Everything changes, usually for the worse. The buffalo go, the Indians get pushed onto reservations. Homesteaders come and try to farm land that's meant for cattle, and men like Mason roam the territory doing as they please because the law can't keep up. You sound like you don't think much of civilization, Lydia observed. I don't think much of what we call civilization, Caleb corrected. Real civilization, people treating each other decent, laws that mean something, communities that look after their own, that I'm in favor of. But what we've got out here, he gestured at the empty landscape. It's every man for himself, and God help you if you can't defend yourself. Is that why you became a bounty hunter? Lydia asked. To bring some kind of justice to a lawless place? Caleb was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, I became a bounty hunter because I needed money, and I was good with a rifle. The justice part came later. after Josh died. Made me realize I could either chase money or chase something that mattered. Both pay about the same, but one of them lets me sleep at night. The sun was touching the horizon when they crested a ridge and saw prospects spread out in the valley below. It wasn't much, maybe 30 buildings clustered around a main street, with a few outlying farms and a creek running through the middle. But after 3 days of captivity and terror, it looked like paradise to Lydia. "Almost there," Caleb said, and she heard relief in his voice. He'd been pushing hard to reach the settlement before dark, though he hadn't complained once. They rode down into Prospect as the light failed and lamps began to glow in windows. A few people were still out. A woman sweeping her porch, a man closing up a general store, a group of children playing some kind of game in the street. They all stopped to stare at the strangers riding in, taking in Lydia's bedraggled appearance and the grim set of Caleb's expression. Caleb headed straight for a building with a sign that read, Dr. Samuel Webb, physician and surgeon. He dismounted and helped Lydia down, then knocked firmly on the door. A man in his 50s answered, wiping his hands on a towel. He had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and the calm demeanor of someone who'd seen every kind of human misery and learned not to be shocked by any of it. "Help you?" he asked. "This young lady needs medical attention," Caleb said. "She's been through an ordeal, rope burns on her wrists, possible injuries from assault, and she hasn't eaten or slept properly in days." Dr. Webb's expression shifted from polite inquiry to professional concern. "Bring her in," he said immediately, standing aside. "What happened?" "Mason gang," Caleb said, and those two words were apparently enough explanation because the doctor's face darkened. "God damn those men," Webb said with quiet fury. "Come on, miss. Let's get you taken care of." The doctor's office was clean and well lit, with glass-fronted cabinets full of bottles and instruments that gleamed in the lamplight. Webb guided Lydia to an examination table and began his assessment with gentle efficiency. Caleb stood by the door, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable in the domestic setting. "I need to go find the marshal and send those telegrams," he said. "Will you be all right here?" Lydia nodded, though part of her wanted to beg him not to leave. In the short hours they'd spent together, he'd become her anchor, the one solid thing in a world that had gone mad. But she could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of responsibility he carried, and she understood he had duties beyond her immediate care. "I'll be fine," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I'll be back," Caleb said. It sounded like a promise. He settled his hat back on his head and left, his footsteps fading down the street. Doctor. Webb cleaned and dressed Lydia's wounds with practiced care, asking questions in a low, soothing voice about her symptoms and injuries. He gave her laudanum for the pain and insisted she eat some broth and bread, watching to make sure she kept it down. Finally, he showed her to a small bedroom in the back of his house where his wife had prepared a bed with clean sheets and a warm quilt. "Sleep," the doctor said firmly. "You're safe here. My wife and I will be in the next room if you need anything." Lydia lay down, still wearing Caleb's coat because she couldn't bear to take it off, and closed her eyes. She expected nightmares, expected to lie awake reliving every moment of her captivity. Instead, exhaustion claimed her immediately, pulling her down into deep, dreamless sleep. She woke once in the night, disoriented and panicking, certain she was back by the river with Mason's hands on her. But then she heard the reassuring sounds of a normal household. Doctor. Webb snoring from the next room, the creak of settling timbers, an owl calling somewhere outside. She remembered where she was and why, and the panic subsided. She thought about Caleb Reeves, about the man who'd ridden down from the ridge like something out of a story, who'd cut her free and carried her from the water and treated her with a decency she'd almost forgotten existed. She wondered if he'd come back as promised, or if he'd already moved on to the next hunt, the next bounty, the next desperate person in need of saving. In the darkness, she touched the rough fabric of his coat and found unexpected comfort in it. Tomorrow she'd face whatever came next, the questions, the aftermath, the long journey back to something resembling a normal life. But tonight, wrapped in the coat of a stranger who'd saved her life, Lydia Carter let herself rest. Outside, the Montana night stretched vast and starlit over a territory where violence and grace walked hand in hand, where the line between survival and death was measured in the time it took to pull a trigger, and where a man named Caleb Reeves rode through the darkness, carrying news of captured outlaws and the woman who'd lived to tell the tale. The story had only just begun. Morning arrived with the smell of coffee and frying bacon, pulling Lydia from sleep so deep it felt like resurrection. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. The bed was too soft, the room too quiet, the air too clean. Then memory returned in a rush. The river, the rope, the rifle shot that had split her fate in two. She sat up carefully, her body cataloging a dozen different pains, and found her wrists neatly bandaged and a clean dress laid out on a chair beside the bed. Mrs. Webb appeared in the doorway as if summoned by the sound of movement. She was a plump woman with gray hair pinned in a neat bun and eyes that missed nothing. "Good, you're awake," she said briskly. "I've drawn you a bath. There's soap and towels, and I've left some of my daughter's old clothes for you. Yours were beyond saving, I'm afraid. We burned them." The bath was hot enough to make Lydia gasp when she lowered herself into the copper tub, but she welcomed the heat, the way it seemed to leach the river's cold from her bones. She scrubbed herself until her skin was pink, washing away 3 days of dirt and fear and the memory of hands that had grabbed her without permission. The water turned gray, then brown, and still she kept washing, as if she could somehow cleanse herself of the entire experience. When she finally emerged, wrapped in a towel that smelled of lavender, she felt more human than she had since the stagecoach stopped on that desolate road. The dress Mrs. Webb had provided was simple calico, faded from many washings but clean and whole. It fit reasonably well, though it was a bit loose in the shoulders. Lydia studied herself in the small mirror above the washstand and barely recognized the face staring back. Pale, hollow-eyed, but alive. Undeniably, impossibly alive. Dr. Webb was waiting at the kitchen with his medical bag open on the table. He examined her wrists with gentle fingers, nodding approval at how the wounds looked in daylight. "No sign of infection," he said. "You were lucky. Another day in those ropes and we'd be having a different conversation." He applied fresh bandages and gave her a small bottle of salve. "Change the dressings twice daily and keep them clean. The bruising will fade in a week or so." "Thank you," Lydia said, "for everything. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You'll repay me by healing and living a good life," Webb said firmly. "That's payment enough." He closed his bag and regarded her seriously. "The marshal came by last night after you'd gone to sleep. He wants to speak with you when you're ready. No rush. He understands what you've been through, but he'll need a statement about the Mason gang for the territorial courts." The thought of reliving those 3 days made Lydia's stomach clench, but she nodded. "I'll speak with him today. Better to get it done." Mrs. Webb insisted she eat breakfast first, placing before her a plate piled with eggs, bacon, fried potatoes, and fresh bread with butter. Lydia hadn't realized how hungry she was until the food was in front of her. She ate everything, surprising herself, while Mrs. Webb beamed approval and poured her coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. "That's better," the older woman said. "You've got some color back in your cheeks, though it'll take more than one meal to put the weight back on you that you lost." The marshal arrived mid-morning, a lean man in his 40s with a drooping mustache and eyes that had seen too much of human nature's dark side. His name was Thomas Bridger, and he removed his hat respectfully when Mrs. Webb showed him into the parlor where Lydia waited. "Miss Carter," he said, taking the chair opposite her. "I'm sorry to intrude so soon after your ordeal, but time is of the essence in these matters. Mr. Reeves has already provided his account, but I need to hear your version of events for the official record." Lydia took a breath and began talking. She told him about the stagecoach robbery, the murders she'd witnessed, the 3 days of captivity. Her voice remained steady through most of it, faltering only when she described the moment they'd dragged her into the river. Marshal Bridger listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small leather book. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, then said, "You're a remarkably composed young woman, Miss Carter. Many people who've been through what you experienced would be in no condition to speak coherently, let alone provide such detailed testimony." "I don't feel composed," Lydia said quietly. "I feel like I'm holding myself together with wire and willpower, and any moment the wire might snap." "Then you're doing a fine job of it," Bridger said. "Your testimony will help ensure Mason hangs, along with whatever other members of his gang we manage to capture." Reeves rode out at first light with a deputy to collect the two he left tied up by the river. Should be back by nightfall. Something in Lydia's chest loosened slightly at the confirmation that Caleb was coming back. She'd been trying not to think about it, trying not to care one way or another, but apparently she'd failed at both. The marshal stood and replaced his hat. You'll likely be called to testify at the trial, but that won't be for a few weeks yet. In the meantime, I'd strongly suggest you stay somewhere safe. Mason's gang is down to 3 men, but they're still dangerous, and they might come looking for revenge. After he left, Lydia sat in the parlor feeling oddly hollow. The telling had drained something from her, left her exhausted despite having slept 12 hours. Mrs. Webb found her there an hour later, staring at nothing, and insisted she lie down again. You've had a shock to your system, the older woman said firmly. It takes time to recover from something like that. Don't push yourself. But Lydia couldn't sleep. She lay on the bed staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through everything that had happened and everything that still lay ahead. The teaching position in Silver Creek seemed like a dream from another lifetime, something that had happened to a different person. She wondered if she could even do it anymore, stand in front of a classroom full of children and teach them reading and arithmetic as if the world were a safe, predictable place. She rose finally and went to the window, looking out at Prospect's quiet main street. A few people moved about their business. A woman carrying a basket, a man leading a mule, children chasing a dog. Normal life, continuing as it always had, indifferent to her trauma. The thought should have been comforting, but instead felt alienating, as if she'd been marked by her experience in ways that separated her permanently from the ordinary world. The afternoon dragged. Mrs. Webb tried to engage her in conversation, in sewing, in helping prepare dinner, but Lydia found she couldn't focus on anything. Her attention kept drifting to the street, watching for a rider on a buckskin horse. Caleb returned as the sun touched the horizon, riding in with a deputy and 2 horses carrying bodies wrapped in canvas. Word spread quickly through the settlement, and by the time they reached the marshal's office, a small crowd had gathered. Lydia watched from the Webb's porch, her heart beating faster than it should. Caleb looked tired, dust-covered, but unhurt. He swung down from his horse and spoke briefly with Marshal Bridger, gesturing toward the wrapped bodies. Even from a distance, his movements carried that same controlled competence she'd noticed before, everything economical and purposeful. He glanced up the street as if feeling her gaze and their eyes met. Even across the distance, she felt the connection like a physical thing. He said something to the marshal, then started walking toward the doctor's house with long, ground-eating strides. "Miss Carter," he said, stopping at the base of the porch steps and touching the brim of his hat. "You're looking considerably better than yesterday." "Thanks to you," Lydia said. Were they still?" "Both dead," Caleb said flatly. "Wolves got to them during the night. Can't say I'm sorry about it. Saved the territory the cost of a trial and a hanging." He climbed the steps and stood beside her, close enough that she could smell horse and leather and the dust of hard riding. "How are you really doing?" The question, asked quietly enough that only she could hear, nearly undid her. She'd maintained her composure through Dr. Webb's examination, through the marshal's questions, through Mrs. Webb's kindness, but something about Caleb's directness cut through her defenses. "I don't know," she admitted. "Better than yesterday, worse than I want to be." He nodded as if this made perfect sense. "It gets easier. Not fast, but it does get easier." "You sound certain." "I am certain. I've been where you are. Different circumstances, same aftermath." He leaned against the porch railing, his profile sharp against the dying light. "The mind takes time to accept that the danger's past. Right now you're still in survival mode, still waiting for the next threat. Eventually your body will catch up with reality and understand that you're safe." "And how long did that take you?" Lydia asked. "About 6 months," Caleb said honestly. "But I'm stubborn, and I didn't have anyone to talk to about it. You've got Dr. Webb and his wife, and you've got me if you need someone who understands." He turned to look at her directly. "I know we barely know each other, but what happened yesterday, that creates a bond whether we want it or not. So if you need to talk or scream or just sit in silence with someone who gets it, I'm available." The offer was so unexpected, so genuine, that Lydia felt tears prickling her eyes again. She blinked them back determinedly. "Thank you," she said. That means more than you know. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the street settle into evening. Lights began appearing in windows, and somewhere a dog barked. Normal sounds, ordinary sounds, the kind that meant safety and home and continuity. Lydia tried to let them soak into her, to believe in them. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "With Mason and the trial and everything?" "Mason's locked up in the territorial prison in Helena," Caleb said. "He'll be tried, convicted, and hanged within the month. The 3 gang members who ran are still out there somewhere, but Marshal Bridgers got their descriptions circulated to every lawman between here and Canada. They'll turn up eventually." He paused. "As for you, that depends on what you want. The teaching position in Silver Creek is still there if you want it. I sent a telegraph yesterday explaining what happened. The school board sent back their condolences and said the job will be held as long as you need." "That's generous of them," Lydia said, though the thought of traveling to Silver Creek, of starting over in a strange town where everyone would know her as the woman who survived the Mason gang, filled her with exhaustion. Caleb seemed to read her hesitation. "Or," he said carefully, "there's another option. My brother Eli and I run a cattle ranch about 2 days' ride south of here. It's not fancy, but it's comfortable, and we've got room. You could stay there for a while, recover properly, figure out what you want to do next without any pressure or deadlines." Lydia looked at him in surprise. "You're inviting me to your ranch? Why?" "Because you need time to heal and a quiet place to do it," Caleb said simply. "Because I know what it's like to have nowhere safe to go after trauma. And because—" He stopped, seeming to consider his words carefully. "Because I think you're someone worth helping, and I'd like to see you come out the other side of this hole and strong." There was something in his voice, some quality of sincerity that made it impossible to doubt his motives. Lydia had spent 3 days learning to read men's intentions in their voices and faces, learning to sense danger, and she sensed none from Caleb Reeves. What she sensed instead was something rare and precious, genuine concern for another person's welfare with no expectation of return. "I'd like that," she heard herself say, "if you're certain it's not an imposition." "It's not," Caleb said firmly. "Eli will be glad of the company. He complains I'm too quiet and serious all the time. Having another person around might improve the general atmosphere." He smiled slightly, and the expression transformed his face, making him look younger and less careworn. "We'll leave day after tomorrow, give you another day to rest up. Dr. Webb can provide you with supplies for the journey." Over dinner that evening with the Webbs, Lydia explained her decision. Mrs. Webb looked relieved. "I think that's wise," she said. "Silver Creek is a fine town, but showing up there right after such an ordeal, with everyone knowing your story, that would be difficult. Better to have some time away from curious eyes and wagging tongues." "Reeves is a good man," Dr. Webb added. "Known him for years. He'll look after you properly, and his ranch is as safe as anywhere in the territory." That night, Lydia lay in bed thinking about the strange turn her life had taken. A week ago, she'd been a school teacher traveling to a new position. Her biggest worry whether the students would be difficult or the winters too harsh. Now she was a survivor of violence, a witness to murder, and about to travel to the ranch of a bounty hunter she'd known for less than 2 days. Nothing about it made conventional sense, but somehow it felt right. Caleb Reeves had saved her life, and in doing so had become tangled up in whatever came next. She didn't understand the connection between them, couldn't explain the way his presence made her feel both safer and more aware of her own vulnerability. But she trusted it in a way she trusted very few things anymore. The next day passed in a blur of preparation. Mrs. Webb helped her pack a small bag of borrowed clothes and necessities. Dr. Webb checked her wrists again and pronounced them healing nicely. Marshal Bridger stopped by with papers for her to sign, official statements that would be used in Mason's trial. Lydia signed them all, her hand steady, committing to memory every word she'd said about those 3 terrible days. Caleb appeared late in the afternoon with supplies for the journey, trail food, blankets, a better coat than the one she'd been wearing. He'd also brought a gentle mare from the livery, a dappled gray with kind eyes. "Her name's Daisy," he said, stroking the horse's neck. "She's steady and sure-footed. You'll be safe riding her." They left at dawn the following morning, the sky still pink and gold with sunrise. The Webbs stood on their porch waving goodbye, and Lydia felt a pang of gratitude so strong it was almost painful. These people had taken in a stranger, cared for her, asked nothing in return. She promised herself she'd find a way to repay their kindness someday. The ride south was nothing like the desperate flight from the river. Caleb set an easy pace, stopping frequently to rest the horses and let Lydia stretch her legs. He talked as they rode, filling the silence with stories about the territory, about cattle ranching, about his brother Eli, who was 3 years younger and had a talent for breaking horses. "Our parents came out here 20 years ago," Caleb said, as they followed a creek through a valley where wildflowers grew thick. "My father wanted land, wanted to build something that would last. He and my mother cleared the ground, built the house and barn, started the herd with 20 head of cattle, worked themselves nearly to death, making it successful." "Are they still there?" Lydia asked. Caleb's expression clouded. "They died 6 years ago. Influenza epidemics swept through the territory, killed a lot of good people. Eli was only 16 and I was barely 21, but we kept the ranch going. Wasn't easy, especially those first few years, but we managed." "I'm sorry," Lydia said. "About your parents. Me too. They were good people, honest and hardworking. Everything they built, Eli and I are trying to honor that legacy." He guided his horse around a fallen log. "What about your family? You said you were traveling to a teaching position. Anyone back home worried about you?" Lydia shook her head. "My mother died of fever when I was 20. My father followed her a year later. I think he just gave up without her. They were one of those couples so devoted to each other that losing one meant losing both. I had a teaching position in a girls' school in St. Louis, but after my father passed, I wanted a change. Wanted to see the West, experience something different from city life." "Well, you've certainly gotten that," Caleb said dryly, "though probably not the way you imagined." "No," Lydia agreed. "Definitely not the way I imagined." They made camp that first night beside a spring where the water bubbled up clear and cold from the rocks. Caleb built a fire with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, and they ate beans and bacon and hardtack that tasted better than it had any right to. Sitting by the fire as darkness fell, Lydia found herself watching Caleb move through the campsite routines, checking the horses, arranging the bedrolls, cleaning the cooking gear. Everything he did was methodical, purposeful, wasted motion eliminated. It was the behavior of someone who'd lived hard and learned to survive by attention to detail. "Can I ask you something?" she said as he settled across the fire from her. "Sure." "Why bounty hunting? You said you needed money for cattle, but there are other ways to earn a living, safer ways." Caleb poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the night. "Because I'm good at it," he said finally, "and because someone has to do it. You've seen what men like Mason do when there's no one to stop them. The territorial marshals do what they can, but they're spread thin, covering hundreds of miles with maybe a dozen men. Bounty hunters fill the gaps. We go places the law can't reach, track men the law can't find, and bring them in for justice." "It sounds dangerous," Lydia said. "It is dangerous. I've been shot 3 times, stabbed twice, and had more close calls than I can count. But it's also necessary." He looked at her across the flames. "When I found you being dragged toward that river, you know what I thought? I thought about Josh's daughters, about all the other people Mason had hurt, and I thought that if I'd been faster, if I'd tracked him down sooner, maybe you wouldn't have had to go through those 3 days. That's what drives me. The idea that every outlaw I bring in is one less threat to innocent people." There was passion in his voice, conviction, and Lydia understood then that this wasn't just a job for Caleb Reeves. It was a calling, something that defined who he was at his core. "That's noble," she said quietly. "It's not noble, it's just necessary," Caleb said, but she could see he was pleased by the observation. "Now get some sleep. We've got another full day's ride tomorrow." Lydia wrapped herself in the blankets he'd provided, lying near enough to the fire to feel its warmth, but far enough that the smoke didn't bother her. The ground was hard beneath her, the night sounds of the wilderness strange and slightly unnerving, but Caleb's presence on the other side of the fire was somehow reassuring. He sat up for a while, keeping watch, his rifle across his knees, and the sight of him there, vigilant, protective, allowed her to finally relax and drift toward sleep. She woke once in the deep hours before dawn, startled by a sound she couldn't identify. Caleb was still sitting by the fire, still watchful, And when he saw her stirring, he made a small gesture that meant everything was fine, go back to sleep. She did, comforted by his wakefulness. The second day of riding brought them into different country, rolling hills covered in grass that waved like an ocean in the wind. They saw cattle in the distance, someone else's herd, and once a small band of antelope that watched them pass with liquid eyes before bounding away in great leaps. Caleb pointed out landmarks as they rode, teaching her to read the land the way he did. That rock formation meant water was nearby. Those trees indicated good soil. The angle of that ridge would protect cattle from winter storms. It was a different kind of education than Lydia was used to providing in her schoolroom, but she found herself absorbed by it, storing away the information as if she might need it someday. "You're a good student," Caleb observed when she successfully identified a spring before they reached it, noting the cluster of willows and the greenness of the grass. "I've always believed in learning whatever I can," Lydia said. "Knowledge is power, regardless of what form it takes." "That's a teacher talking," Caleb said with a smile. As afternoon stretched toward evening, they topped a rise and Caleb reined in his horse, gesturing ahead. "There," he said. "That's home." Lydia looked where he pointed and saw the Reeves Ranch spread out in the valley below. A white-painted house with a wide porch, a large barn painted red with white trim, several corrals, and beyond them open rangeland where cattle grazed. It was modest by the standards of the big ranches she'd heard about, but it looked solid and well-maintained, a place carved from the wilderness through hard work and determination. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "It's home," Caleb said, and the simple pride in his voice made her smile. They rode down into the valley as the sun painted everything gold. A figure emerged from the barn, a young man with Caleb's build but lighter hair and a more open, friendly expression. He waved when he saw them approaching. "That's Eli," Caleb said. "Fair warning, he talks more than I do and asks a lot of questions." Eli met them in the yard, his curiosity obvious but tempered by good manners. He helped Lydia down from her horse with a gentleness that reminded her of his brother, then extended his hand. "Eli Reeves, ma'am. Caleb sent a telegraph saying he was bringing a guest. You're very welcome here." "Lydia Carter," she said, shaking his hand. "Thank you for allowing me to impose on your hospitality." "No imposition at all," Eli said cheerfully. "House has been too quiet with just the two of us. It'll be nice to have someone else around, especially someone who might civilize my brother a bit." "I heard that," Caleb said mildly, unsaddling the horses. "You were meant to," Eli shot back with a grin. He turned to Lydia. "Come on, I'll show you where you'll be staying. We've got a spare room that was our parents'. It's the nicest room in the house." The house was comfortable inside, clearly the home of two men who valued function over decoration, but still maintained basic standards of cleanliness. Eli showed her to a bedroom that was indeed the nicest in the house, larger than the others, with a real bed frame and mattress, a dresser, and windows that looked out over the valley. "Caleb and I can bring your things in," Eli said. "Bathroom's down the hall. We've got an actual indoor pump, installed it last year. One of our few luxuries." Left alone, Lydia sat on the bed and felt something in her chest loosen for the first time since the stagecoach robbery. This place felt safe in a way Prospect hadn't, despite the Webbs' kindness. Maybe it was the isolation, the distance from other people and their questions. Maybe it was the simple fact of being somewhere that existed outside her trauma, a place with no connection to Mason or rivers or ropes. Or maybe, she admitted to herself, it was Caleb Reeves and the quiet strength he radiated, the sense that here, under his watch, nothing bad would be allowed to happen. Dinner that evening was a simple affair. Eli had made a beef stew that was surprisingly good, and they ate at a rough wooden table while Caleb filled his brother in on everything that had happened. Eli listened with growing horror, his young face darkening as the story unfolded. "Christ, Caleb," he said when it was finished. "And Mason's really behind bars." "For now," Caleb said. "He'll hang within the month." "Good," Eli said savagely. "Bastard deserves it." He looked at Lydia apologetically. "Pardon my language, ma'am." "Under the circumstances, I think strong language is warranted," Lydia said. After dinner, Eli excused himself to check on the horses one last time, leaving Caleb and Lydia alone in the house. Caleb poured coffee, and they sat on the porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. I meant what I said before, Caleb said after a while. You can stay here as long as you need. No time limit, no expectations. When you're ready to move on to Silver Creek or wherever else you want to go, we'll help you get there. But until then, this is a safe place to heal. Thank you, Lydia said, the words feeling inadequate for the magnitude of what he was offering. I don't understand why you're being so kind to me. You don't even know me. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his coffee cup cradled in his hands. Maybe I don't know your history or your favorite color or what books you like to read, he said finally. But I know what it looks like when someone's hanging on by a thread. I know what it costs to survive something that should have killed you. And I know that healing happens better when you're not alone. He turned to look at her, his pale eyes serious in the starlight. Besides, I do know some things about you. I know you're brave. You didn't break during those 3 days, didn't give up even when they dragged you into that river. I know you're strong. You're sitting here having a normal conversation 2 days after the worst experience of your life. And I know you're worth saving, because everyone is, but especially people who've done nothing to deserve the violence that found them. Something in his words reached past all of Lydia's defenses and touched the raw, wounded core of her. She felt tears threatening again and blinked them back, but Caleb saw anyway. It's all right to cry, he said gently. You don't have to be strong every minute of every day. I feel like if I start, I won't stop, Lydia admitted. Then cry until you're empty, Caleb said. And when you're done, tomorrow will still be here, and so will we. The simple acceptance in his voice, the complete absence of judgment or pity, finally broke through the last of her composure. Lydia cried then, and Caleb sat beside her in the darkness, close enough that she could feel his solid presence, far enough to give her space, and let her grieve for everything she'd lost and everything she'd survived. When the storm passed, she felt hollowed out but somehow cleaner, as if tears had washed away some poison she'd been carrying. She wiped her eyes and found Caleb watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Better? He asked. Different, she said. Maybe that's the same thing. Maybe it is, Caleb agreed. He stood and offered her his hand. Come on, tomorrow's another day and it starts early on a ranch. You should get some sleep. Lydia took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. His grip was warm and calloused and steady, and she held on a moment longer than strictly necessary before releasing it. Good night, Caleb, she said. Good night, Lydia. She went to her room and lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Horses shifting in the barn, the wind in the cottonwoods, the distant call of a coyote. Her wrists still ached beneath their bandages, her body still carried bruises from the outlaw's rough handling, but for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt something other than fear and desperation. She felt the possibility of healing, the chance of moving forward, the hope that maybe, somehow, she could build something new from the wreckage of what had been destroyed. Outside her window, the Montana night stretched vast and starlit, and somewhere in the house, Caleb Reeves sat cleaning his rifle with the methodical patience of a man who understood that vigilance was the price of safety. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new moments to navigate, but tonight was simply about rest and the promise that morning would come, and with it, the slow, difficult work of becoming whole again. The river had tried to take her, but she had survived, and survival, she was beginning to understand, was just the beginning of the story, not the end. The first light of dawn filtered through the curtains of Lydia's room, pale and tentative, carrying with it the sounds of a working ranch coming to life. She heard boots on the porch, the low murmur of male voices, the whinny of horses eager for their morning feed. For a moment she lay still, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Then memory returned, and with it a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty. She was at the Reeves Ranch, 2 days' ride from Prospect, 3 weeks removed from the teaching position that had brought her west in the first place. Her life had been torn apart and reassembled into a shape she didn't yet recognize. She rose and dressed in one of the simple cotton dresses Mrs. Webb had provided, then stood at the window looking out over the valley. The land stretched away in all directions, rolling grassland punctuated by clusters of cottonwoods and the dark shapes of grazing cattle. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache, so open, so vast, so utterly different from the cramped streets and brick buildings of St. Louis. This was a place where you could see weather coming from miles away, where the sky dominated everything, where a person could disappear into distance and silence. She found Caleb and Eli in the kitchen, the older brother pouring coffee while the younger fried eggs and bacon. They both looked up when she entered, and Eli's face broke into a welcoming smile. "Morning, Miss Carter," he said cheerfully. "Hope you slept well. Coffee?" "Please," Lydia said, accepting the cup Caleb offered. "And you can call me Lydia. Miss Carter makes me feel like I'm back in the schoolroom." "Lydia it is," Eli said, sliding eggs onto a plate. "You teaching long before all this happened?" 5 years, Lydia said, sitting at the table. "Started right after my mother died. It seemed like good work, helping children learn to read and write, preparing them for whatever life they'd choose." "Noble profession," Caleb said, taking the chair across from her. He looked like he'd been up for hours already, his hair damp from washing, his shirt clean but worn soft from many launderings. Territory needs more teachers, too many kids growing up unable to read their own names. "That's what drew me west," Lydia said. "In St. Louis, there were plenty of teachers. Out here, I thought I could make more of a difference." "You still can," Eli said, setting plates in front of them. "Silver Creek's not going anywhere. When you're ready, that job will still be there." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. Then Caleb said, "Eli and I need to ride out this morning to check fence lines and move some cattle to better grazing. We'll be gone most of the day. You're welcome to come along if you want, or you can stay here and rest. House is yours. There's books in the parlor, and if you want to explore the immediate area, just don't go too far." "I think I'll stay," Lydia said. The idea of spending hours in the saddle made her newly healing body protest. "Maybe do some reading, get my bearings." "Help yourself to anything you need," Caleb said. "We should be back by late afternoon." After they left, the house fell into a silence that was both peaceful and slightly unnerving. Lydia washed the breakfast dishes, moving slowly, letting her mind wander. The simple domestic task was oddly soothing, something normal and predictable after days of chaos and fear. When she finished, she explored the house more thoroughly than she'd been able to the night before. The parlor held a collection of books that surprised her with its breadth, leather-bound volumes of Shakespeare and Dickens alongside practical guides to animal husbandry and territorial history. There were books on astronomy, on geology, on the flora and fauna of the American West. Someone in this house valued learning, valued knowledge for its own sake. She found a slim volume of poetry by Whitman and took it to the porch, settling into a rocking chair that looked out over the valley. The morning was warm, but not yet hot, and a breeze carried the scent of grass and wildflowers. She tried to read, but found her attention drifting, her gaze drawn to the distant mountains, to the hawks circling high above, to the simple fact of being alive and safe when she might so easily have been neither. Her thoughts turned inevitably to Caleb Reeves. In the space of 4 days, he'd become the most important person in her life. The man who'd saved her, sheltered her, offered her a place to heal without asking anything in return. She barely knew him, yet she trusted him in ways she'd never trusted anyone. It was unsettling and comforting in equal measure. She wondered what drove a man to choose the life he'd chosen. Bounty hunting was dangerous, lonely work that required a particular kind of strength, not just physical, but moral. You had to believe in justice strongly enough to risk your life for it, had to be willing to track evil men through hostile territory and face them down with nothing but your skill and nerve. And yet Caleb didn't seem bitter or hardened by it. There was gentleness in him, a capacity for kindness that spoke of a core self that violence hadn't managed to corrupt. Lost in these thoughts, she almost didn't hear the sound of approaching horses until they were quite close. She looked up sharply, her heart suddenly racing, old fear flooding back. But it was just 2 riders she didn't recognize, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and a younger one who might have been his son. They reined in at the edge of the yard, and the older man touched his hat respectfully. "Morning, ma'am," he called. "We're looking for Caleb Reeves. He around?" Lydia stood, conscious of being alone and vulnerable, but trying not to show it. "He rode out this morning, should be back this afternoon." "Mind if we wait?" the man asked. "We've come a fair distance." Something in Lydia hesitated. These men seemed harmless enough, but after Mason and his gang, she'd learned that appearances could deceive. Still, refusing them would be inhospitable, and this was Caleb's ranch, not hers. She had no right to turn away his potential business. "You can water your horses," she said carefully, "but I'd prefer if you waited outside." The man's expression showed understanding rather than offense. "That's fair, ma'am. We'll make ourselves comfortable in the shade of the barn." They led their horses to the trough and settled themselves on a bench outside the barn door, well away from the house. Lydia watched them from the porch, trying not to be obvious about it, noting how they moved, how they spoke to each other. They seemed relaxed, genuine, but she kept the door within easy reach anyway. The wait stretched longer than she'd anticipated. Noon came and went, and still Caleb and Eli didn't return. The two visitors remained by the barn, patient and unthreatening, occasionally exchanging quiet words. Finally, in the early afternoon, Lydia brought them water and some bread and cheese, her hospitality warring with her caution. "Thank you kindly, ma'am," the older man said, accepting the food. "Name's Tom Barrett. This is my son, Daniel. We run cattle about 20 miles north of here." "Lydia Carter," she said, relaxing slightly. Cattlemen were common enough in this territory, and these two had the look of honest ranchers rather than outlaws. "You're the young lady Caleb pulled out of the Snake River," Barrett said, not making it a question. "Word travels fast in these parts. What those men did to you and the others on that stagecoach, terrible business. Glad Caleb got there when he did." "So am I," Lydia said quietly. "He's a good man, Caleb Reeves," Barrett continued. "Helped us out last year when rustlers hit our herd, tracked them down, recovered most of our cattle. Wouldn't even take the full reward we offered. Said he was just doing what was right." The endorsement eased the last of Lydia's tension. She found herself sitting on the bench with them, asking about their ranch, about the territory, about the challenges of raising cattle in this harsh climate. Barrett was a natural storyteller, and his tales of blizzards and drought and the constant battle against predators painted a picture of a life that was hard but deeply satisfying. "Takes a special kind of person to make it out here," Barrett said. "You've got to be tough, but not hard, if you understand the difference. Got to be willing to work until your hands bleed but still find joy in a sunrise. The land will break you if you let it, but if you can bend without breaking, there's no better life anywhere." "Is that what kept you here?" Lydia asked, "after all the hardships?" "That and stubbornness," Barrett said with a grin. "My wife always said I was too ornery to admit defeat. But yes, mainly it's the land itself. Gets into your blood somehow. I spent 20 years back east before coming out here, and I can't imagine going back. This place..." He gestured at the valley, the mountains, the endless sky. "It's real in a way cities never are. You make your living with your own hands, stand or fall on your own merit. There's something honest about that." They were still talking when Caleb and Eli rode in, both men dusty and tired-looking. Caleb's eyes went immediately to Lydia, checking that she was all right before registering the visitors. "Tom," he said, swinging down from his horse. "Everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Barrett said, standing and shaking Caleb's hand. "Actually came to offer you some work, if you're interested." They moved to the barn to talk business, and Lydia returned to the house with Eli, who was limping slightly. "Horse stepped wrong and threw me," he explained, seeing her concerned look. "Nothing serious, just bruised my hip. Happens." "You should let me look at it," Lydia said. "I learned basic nursing from my mother. She helped care for neighbors who got sick." Eli protested that he was fine, but she insisted, and after examining the bruise, which was spectacular, purple spreading across his entire hip, she made him a cold compress and gave him some of the willow bark tea Dr. Webb had sent along for pain. "You'd make a good ranch wife," Eli said with a grin as she fussed over him. "You've got that practical, no-nonsense way about you." "I'll take that as a compliment," Lydia said dryly. "Now sit still and let the compress work." Caleb found them like that an hour later, Eli stretched on the sofa with the compress on his hip, while Lydia read aloud from one of the books she'd found. He stood in the doorway watching them for a moment, his expression unreadable, before clearing his throat. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Eli had a disagreement with his horse," Lydia said. "The horse won, but he'll be fine. Happens to the best of us," Caleb said. He looked tired, she noticed, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from long hours of hard physical labor. "Tom Barrett offered me a job tracking some cattle thieves who've been hitting ranches north of here. Good money, and it's the kind of work that needs doing." "When would you leave?" Lydia asked, trying to keep her voice neutral despite the sudden flutter of anxiety in her chest. "Day after tomorrow," Caleb said. "I'll be gone about a week, maybe less if I pick up their trail quickly." He hesitated, then said, "You'll be safe here with Eli. He's good with a rifle, and the nearest neighbor is Tom Barrett, who I trust completely. But if you'd rather I didn't go, I can send word that I'm unavailable." The offer surprised her. He was willing to turn down paying work because she might feel unsafe without him. The gesture touched her more than she wanted to admit. "You should go," she said firmly. "I'll be fine. Eli and I will keep each other company, and I'm sure I can find ways to make myself useful around the ranch." Something in Caleb's expression eased. "All right then, I'll leave at first light on Wednesday." That evening they ate dinner together, the three of them falling into an easy rhythm of conversation that felt almost like family. Eli told stories about growing up on the ranch, about his and Caleb's misadventures as boys. Caleb added occasional dry comments that made both Lydia and Eli laugh. The meal stretched long, no one in a hurry to leave the table, the lamplight warm and golden in the kitchen. Later, after Eli had gone to bed early because of his bruised hip, Caleb and Lydia sat on the porch as had become their habit. The night was clear and cool, stars scattered thick across the sky. "Can I ask you something?" Lydia said after a long silence. "Sure." "The books in your parlor, Shakespeare, Whitman, Dickens. I wouldn't have expected a cattleman and bounty hunter to have such a collection." Caleb smiled slightly. "Those belong to my mother. She was a schoolteacher back in Ohio before she married my father. She believed education was as important as food or shelter, maybe more so. She made sure Eli and I could read and write and do figures before we ever set foot in a schoolhouse. Some of my earliest memories are of her reading to us by the fire, teaching us about places we'd never seen, ideas we'd never have encountered otherwise." "She sounds remarkable," Lydia said. "She was," Caleb agreed. "When she and my father died, Eli wanted to get rid of most of their things, said it hurt too much to be reminded of them. But I couldn't let the books go. They felt like the best part of her, all that knowledge and beauty she valued. Sometimes when I'm out tracking some dangerous man through country that wants to kill me, I think about those books sitting here safe in the house, and it reminds me why I do this work. To protect beautiful things, to make sure people like my mother can exist in the world without fear." The admission was so honest, so vulnerable, that Lydia felt her throat tighten. She reached across the space between their chairs and touched his hand where it rested on the armrest. His fingers turned and caught hers, warm and strong, and they sat like that for a long moment, connected by more than just physical touch. "Thank you for telling me that," she said quietly. "Thank you for asking," Caleb replied. The next day passed in preparation for Caleb's departure. He cleaned his weapons meticulously, checked his tack and supplies, studied maps of the territory where the cattle thieves had been operating. Lydia watched him work, noting the care he took with every detail. This wasn't the preparation of someone who took unnecessary risks. This was the work of a man who understood that survival depended on thorough planning. She spent her own time making herself useful around the house, cleaning and organizing, mending shirts she found that needed repair. Eli protested that she didn't need to work, that she was a guest, but she insisted. "I need to feel useful," she told him. "Sitting idle just gives me too much time to think about things I'd rather not remember." Eli understood that without further explanation. "Well, if you insist on working, maybe you could teach me to cook something besides bacon and beans. Caleb and I have been eating the same 5 meals for 6 years. So she did, showing him how to make a proper pot roast, how to bake bread that didn't come out hard as rocks, how to season food with the herbs that grew wild near the creek. Eli proved an eager student, and they spent the afternoon in the kitchen, flour dusting the table, the smell of baking bread filling the house. Caleb appeared in the doorway mid-afternoon and stopped, a smile spreading across his face. "Is that bread I smell?" he asked. "Real bread." "Don't sound so shocked," Lydia said, pulling the golden loaves from the oven. "Did you think I couldn't cook?" "I didn't think about it one way or the other," Caleb admitted. "But this smells like heaven." They ate dinner early that night, the fresh bread still warm, the pot roast tender and rich. Caleb ate 3 helpings and declared it the best meal he'd had since his mother died. Lydia felt absurdly pleased by the compliment. by the simple act of feeding someone who appreciated it. After dinner, Eli excused himself again. His hip was still bothering him, and Lydia found herself alone with Caleb for what would be their last evening before he left. They settled on the porch, as usual, but the air felt different somehow, charged with something neither of them was quite ready to name. "I don't want you to worry while I'm gone," Caleb said. "This job is straightforward. Track the thieves, bring them in, or drive them out of the territory. I've done it dozens of times." "But it's still dangerous," Lydia said. "Everything worth doing is dangerous," Caleb replied. He looked at her in the dimming light. "Besides, I've got reason to come back now. That makes a man more careful." The implication in his words made her breath catch. "Caleb, I know it's too soon," he said quietly. "I know you're still healing from what happened, and the last thing you need is me complicating things. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel something when I look at you. Something that started when I saw you in that river, and you looked up at me like I was the answer to a prayer. Something that's gotten stronger every day since." Lydia's heart was racing now, torn between fear and something that felt dangerously close to hope. "I feel it too," she admitted, "but I don't know what it means. I don't know if I'm capable of anything beyond just surviving right now." "I'm not asking for anything," Caleb said. "I just wanted you to know, so that while I'm gone, you'll understand why I'm careful, why I'll do everything possible to come back whole, because there's someone here worth coming back to." She stood and moved to where he sat, and before she could second-guess herself, she leaned down and kissed him. It was brief, chaste, nothing more than a press of lips, but it carried the weight of everything they hadn't said and everything they might someday say. "Come back safe," she whispered against his mouth. "Please." "I will," he promised. "I swear it." He left at dawn the next morning, the sky still gray with pre-sunrise light. Lydia stood on the porch and watched him ride away, his figure growing smaller until the distance swallowed him completely. The valley felt emptier without him, the ranch suddenly too quiet, too vast. Eli came to stand beside her. "He'll be all right," he said. "Caleb always comes back. He's too stubborn to do anything else." "I hope you're right," Lydia said. The week that followed passed in a strange suspension of time. Days bled together in a routine of ranch work and quiet evenings, of watching the horizon for riders who didn't come. Eli proved to be good company, easier to talk to than his older brother, more willing to share stories and ask questions. He told her about their childhood, about learning to ride before they could read, about the time they tried to catch a wild Mustang and ended up hanging on for dear life while it dragged them through a creek. "Caleb's always been the serious one," Eli said as they mended fence one afternoon. "Even as a kid, he felt responsible for everything. After our parents died, he basically raised me, even though he was barely an adult himself. Made sure I finished my schooling, taught me everything about running the ranch, never let me slack off or feel sorry for myself." "That's a heavy burden for someone so young," Lydia observed. "He never complained," Eli said. "That's just who he is, takes care of people. It's why he does the bounty hunting. Not for the money, though that helps, but because he genuinely believes it's his duty to make the world safer for folks who can't protect themselves." "He told me something similar," Lydia said. "Did he tell you about Sarah?" Eli asked, then immediately looked like he regretted the question. Lydia's hands stilled on the fence post she'd been securing. "No, who's Sarah?" Eli hesitated, clearly debating whether to continue, then sighed. "Sarah Mitchum. She was our neighbor's daughter, and Caleb was sweet on her for years. Everyone thought they'd get married. But 3 years ago, she decided ranch life wasn't for her. She wanted city living, wanted comfort and society and things Caleb couldn't give her. She left for San Francisco and married a banker." "That must have hurt him," Lydia said quietly. "It did, though he'd never admit it," Eli said. "He threw himself into the bounty hunting after that, stayed away from home more than he was here. I think it was easier for him to chase dangerous men than deal with his own feelings." He looked at Lydia directly. "I'm telling you this because you should know. My brother doesn't open up easily. If he's let you in even a little bit, that means something. Don't take it lightly." "I won't," Lydia promised. On the 5th day of Caleb's absence, a storm rolled in from the west, dark clouds piling high and ominous. The wind picked up, bending the grass in waves, and thunder rumbled in the distance. Eli hurried to secure the barn and get the horses under cover while Lydia closed shutters and brought in anything that might blow away. The storm hit with fury just after sunset, rain lashing the house in sheets, wind howling around the eaves. Lightning split the sky in jagged forks, and thunder shook the walls. Lydia and Eli sat in the parlor by lamplight, trying to read but mostly just listening to the storm's violence. "Hope Caleb found shelter," Eli muttered, his worry obvious despite his attempt to sound casual. "I'm sure he did," Lydia said, with more confidence than she felt. "He knows this country." But as the storm raged through the night, she found herself unable to sleep, lying in bed imagining Caleb caught in the deluge, cold and wet and possibly injured. Every crack of thunder made her jump. Every gust of wind seemed to carry threat. She told herself she was being foolish, that Caleb had survived far worse than a summer storm, but logic couldn't touch the fear that had taken root in her chest. Morning came gray and rain-soaked, the storm lessening but not breaking. Lydia made breakfast mechanically, her attention divided between the food and the windows, watching for movement that never came. The rain finally stopped mid-afternoon, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet earth. Eli went out to assess any damage to the ranch buildings, and Lydia stood on the porch, scanning the valley with shaded eyes. And there, finally, a rider appeared on the ridge, a lone figure on a buckskin horse, moving at a steady walk. Her heart leaped before her mind could catch up, and she was off the porch and running before she'd made a conscious decision to move. Caleb saw her coming and urged his horse into a trot. He looked exhausted, soaked through despite his oilcloth coat, but whole and unharmed. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped and caught Lydia as she reached him, her momentum carrying her into his arms. "Easy," he said, but he was smiling, his arms coming around her and holding tight. "I'm all right, just wet and tired." "You're 5 days late," Lydia said into his shoulder, not caring that she was soaking her dress from his wet coat. I was worried. "The thieves led us on a chase through some rough country," Caleb said, "and then the storm delayed us getting back. I'm sorry I worried you." She pulled back enough to look at his face, searching for injuries she might have missed. There was a fresh cut above his eyebrow, already scabbed over, and he moved stiffly, favoring his left side. "You're hurt," she said. "Just bruised ribs," Caleb said. "One of the thieves got in a lucky hit before we subdued him. Nothing serious." "Inside," Lydia ordered. "Now. You need dry clothes and hot food and those ribs looked at." "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said, his smile widening. He let her lead him toward the house, and if his hand lingered in hers longer than strictly necessary, neither of them mentioned it. Eli appeared from the barn and whooped when he saw his brother. "About time. We were starting to think you'd run off to Mexico." "Thought about it," Caleb said dryly. "But the company's better here." Inside, Lydia took charge with the same practical efficiency she'd shown with Eli's injury. She made Caleb strip off his wet clothes, turning her back for modesty but staying in the room to make sure he didn't hide any injuries, and examined his ribs with gentle fingers that still made him wince. "Definitely bruised," she pronounced. "Maybe cracked. You need to rest them." "I've had worse," Caleb said, but he didn't protest when she wrapped his torso with strips of cloth to support the injury. Over dinner, he told them about tracking the cattle thieves through increasingly difficult terrain, the confrontation that had led to his bruised ribs, and the eventual capture of 3 men who were now in the territorial prison awaiting trial. "Tom Barrett was pleased," Caleb said, "paid the full bounty and threw in a bonus. Said if I ever need work, I've got a standing offer to help with his ranch." "Maybe you should consider it," Lydia said quietly. "Legitimate ranch work instead of chasing dangerous men." Caleb looked at her, and something passed between them, an understanding, a possibility, the beginning of a conversation they'd need to have eventually. "Maybe," he said. "I've been thinking about that lately, thinking about what kind of life I want versus the life I've been living." After dinner, Eli declared he was going to bed early, his excuse so transparent that both Caleb and Lydia laughed. But they took the gift of privacy he offered, moving to the porch where the storm-washed air smelled fresh and new. "I miss this," Caleb said, settling carefully into his usual chair. "Miss these evenings. Miss talking to you." "I missed you," Lydia admitted. "More than I expected to. More than makes sense given how short a time we've known each other. Time doesn't measure everything, Caleb said. Sometimes connections happen fast and run deep. I learned that when I pulled you out of that river and you looked at me like I'd hung the moon. I knew right then that you were going to matter to me. You saved my life, Lydia said. That's bound to create feelings that might not be. This isn't gratitude, Caleb interrupted gently. Not on my side, anyway. Is it on yours? Lydia thought about the past week, about the fear she'd felt during the storm, about the overwhelming relief when she'd seen him riding toward the ranch. She thought about the way her day felt more complete when he was in it, about how his presence made her feel both safer and more alive. No, she said finally, it's not gratitude. It's something else. Something I'm not sure I'm ready for, but can't seem to stop feeling anyway. Then don't stop it, Caleb said. Don't fight it or question it or try to logic it away. Just let it be what it is and see where it goes. He held out his hand, and after only a moment's hesitation, she took it. They sat like that as darkness fell completely, hands linked, the future uncertain but no longer quite so frightening, and for the first time since the stagecoach robbery, Lydia felt something other than simply surviving. She felt the possibility of actually living again, of building something new and good from the wreckage of what had been destroyed. The river had tried to take her, but Caleb had refused to let it, and now, in the quiet of a Montana evening with his hand warm in hers, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could do more than survive. She could heal. She could hope. She could even, perhaps, love again. The weeks that followed Caleb's return settled into a rhythm that felt almost like belonging. Lydia woke each morning to the sound of the brothers moving through their ranch routines, the comfortable cadence of men who'd worked together so long they barely needed words. She'd dress and join them for breakfast, contributing meals that made Eli groan with pleasure and earned her Caleb's quiet smiles of appreciation. After the men rode out to whatever work the day demanded, she'd spend her time making the ranch house into something more than just a place where two bachelors slept between dawn and dusk. She scrubbed floors that hadn't seen proper attention in years, mended curtains worn thin by Montana sun, organized shelves that had devolved into chaos. The work was therapeutic in ways she hadn't anticipated. Each clean corner, each repaired item, felt like reclaiming control over a world that had spun violently out of her grasp. Her wrists healed slowly, the angry red rope burns fading to pink, and then to white scars she traced sometimes in the mirror, reminders of what she'd survived. But it was the evenings she lived for, those hours after dinner when Eli would make himself scarce and she and Caleb would find themselves on the porch as the sun painted the valley in shades of amber and rose. They talked about everything and nothing, his childhood memories of helping his father build the barn, her experiences teaching children who'd never held a book before, the dreams they'd had as younger people, and how those dreams had shifted with experience and loss. I used to think I'd travel the world, Lydia said one evening about 3 weeks after Caleb's return. See Paris and Rome and all those places my mother read about. Teach in schools across Europe, experience different cultures, collect stories to bring home. What changed? Caleb asked. He was whittling a piece of wood, his hands moving with unconscious skill, shavings curling onto the porch boards. Life changed, Lydia said. My mother got sick, and suddenly travel seemed selfish when she needed care. Then my father followed her so quickly, it felt like dying of a broken heart was actually possible. After that, I just wanted stability, wanted to build something solid instead of chasing adventures that might never materialize. And Silver Creek was supposed to be that stability, Caleb said. Yes. Lydia watched the sun touch the mountains. A teaching position, a little house, a community where I could put down roots. Simple dreams, really, but even those got torn away. Caleb set down his whittling and turned to look at her directly. They don't have to be torn away. Silver Creek is still there. That job is still being held for you. When you're ready, I'll take you there myself. Make sure you're settled safe. Something in his words made her chest tighten. When I'm ready, she repeated. What if I'm never ready? What if going there means leaving something behind that I don't want to leave? The air between them shifted, charged with the thing they'd been dancing around for weeks. Caleb's pale eyes held hers, and she saw her own uncertainty reflected there, along with something deeper, something that made her breath catch. Then don't go. he said quietly. Stay here instead. Caleb, I know what you're going to say, he interrupted gently. That it's too soon, that you're not thinking clearly, that gratitude and genuine feeling are hard to separate. But Lydia, I've been thinking about this every day since I pulled you out of that river. I didn't plan it, didn't want complications, but here we are. And every morning I wake up knowing you're in this house makes the day start better. Every evening talking with you makes everything that came before worth enduring. Lydia stood and moved to the porch railing, needing the distance to think clearly. Behind her, she heard Caleb rise, but he didn't approach, giving her space even as he laid his heart bare. I care about you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. More than I should after such a short time. But I don't know if what I'm feeling is real or just my mind clinging to the person who saved me. How can I trust my own emotions when everything's still so tangled up with trauma? You can't, Caleb said. Not yet. And I'm not asking you to. I'm just asking you to stay long enough to find out. No pressure, no expectations. Stay through the summer, help Eli and me with the ranch. Let yourself heal properly. And if at the end of it you decide Silver Creek is where you belong, I'll take you there with my blessing and no hard feelings. She turned to face him. And if I stay? If it turns out this is real? What then? Then we build something, Caleb said simply. Together, whatever that looks like. The promise in his words, the complete absence of demand or manipulation, made something inside her settle and shift. She crossed the space between them and took his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his fingers as they curled around hers. All right, she said, I'll stay through the summer. But Caleb, you have to promise me something. Anything. If you take another bounty hunting job, you have to promise to be more careful, because her voice caught. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you. His free hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. I promise, he said. No more unnecessary risks. In fact, I've been thinking about Tom Barrett's offer. Steady ranch work might not pay as well, but it's considerably less likely to get me shot. I prefer you not shot, Lydia said, and despite the seriousness of the conversation, they both smiled. He leaned down and kissed her then, soft and careful, asking permission with every movement. She kissed him back, letting herself feel the warmth of it, the rightness, the promise of something good growing from such terrible beginnings. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. I'm going to court you properly, he said, the way you deserve. Not because you owe me anything, but because I want to earn your trust and your heart honestly. You already have both, Lydia admitted, more than I probably should have given. But I want the courting anyway. I want the time to be sure, to build something solid. Then that's what we'll do, Caleb said. The next morning at breakfast, Eli took one look at them and grinned so wide it nearly split his face. Finally, he said, I was starting to think I'd have to lock you two in a room together. Mind your own business, Caleb said mildly, but there was no heat in it. Your business is my business when it improves both your dispositions this noticeably, Eli retorted. He looked at Lydia. So you're staying then? Through the summer, at least, Lydia confirmed. If you'll have me. Have you? Lydia, you've turned this house into an actual home and taught me to cook food that doesn't taste like leather. You can stay forever as far as I'm concerned. Eli paused, then added more seriously. But really, we're both glad. This place is better with you in it. The days took on new texture after that. Caleb began teaching Lydia to ride properly. Not just the basic survival riding she'd done, but real horsemanship. How to read an animal's mood, how to move with its rhythm, how to communicate through subtle shifts of weight and rein pressure. They'd ride out together in the early mornings when the air was still cool, exploring the ranch boundaries and the wild country beyond. One morning, about a week after their conversation on the porch, they rode to a high meadow where wildflowers grew so thick the ground looked painted. Caleb helped her down from her horse, and they walked through the blooms, Lydia naming the ones she recognized from botanical books: lupine and Indian paintbrush, columbine and wild rose. My mother would have loved this place, she said, bending to touch a particularly perfect lupine. She had a garden back in St. Louis, Spent every spare moment in it. She said flowers were proof that God had a sense of beauty as well as utility. Smart woman, Caleb said. He was watching Lydia rather than the flowers, his expression soft in the morning light. She was, Lydia agreed. She straightened and looked at him. I think she would have liked you. She always said the measure of a man wasn't in his words, but in his actions, and whether he did right when no one was watching. I'm not sure I always measure up to that standard, Caleb said honestly. I've done things I'm not proud of, hurt people who probably didn't deserve it as much as I told myself they did. Such as? He was quiet for a long moment, then said, There was a man 2 years ago, wanted for robbery and assault. I tracked him for 3 weeks, finally cornered him in a line shack in the mountains. He tried to draw on me and I shot him. Standard bounty hunter work. But later I found out he had a family, a wife, and 2 kids who depended on him. The money he'd stolen was to pay for his daughter's medicine. She had lung fever, and the doctor wanted payment up front. That wasn't your fault, Lydia said. You couldn't have known. Couldn't I? Caleb's voice was heavy with old guilt. If I'd talked to him instead of just assuming he was another outlaw, if I'd brought him in alive instead of shooting first, maybe there was another way that wouldn't have left 2 kids without a father. Oh, Lydia took his hand. Or maybe he would have killed you and gone on to hurt other people. You can't carry the weight of every possible alternative outcome, Caleb. You did what you thought was right with the information you had. I know, he said. Logically, I know that. But it still haunts me sometimes. It's part of why I want to stop bounty hunting, why I'm ready to just work the ranch and live a quieter life. I'm tired of making life or death decisions about people I don't really know. She squeezed his hand, understanding in that moment why he was so careful with her, so gentle and patient. He'd seen what violence could do, how quickly it could destroy lives, and he was determined not to be careless with something as precious as another person's heart. They stood together in the flower-filled meadow, and Lydia felt something shift inside her, a loosening of the last defenses she'd been holding against him. Whatever this was between them, it was real and worth protecting, worth the risk of believing in again. The summer deepened, days growing longer and hotter. Lydia learned the rhythm of ranch work, helping where she could, gathering eggs from the chickens they kept near the house, tending the vegetable garden that had gone wild from neglect, even learning to milk the 2 dairy cows whose names were Buttercup and Daisy. The physical work was satisfying in ways her teaching had never been, though she found herself missing the classroom sometimes, missing the spark in a child's eyes when a difficult concept finally clicked. You could teach here, Eli suggested one afternoon as they weeded the garden together. Not at a formal school, but there are ranch families scattered all through this territory. Kids who don't get any education at all because the nearest schoolhouse is 50 miles away. You could ride circuit, teach at different ranches, the way circuit preachers do with religion. The idea lodged in Lydia's mind and wouldn't let go. She mentioned it to Caleb that evening, half expecting him to dismiss it as impractical. Instead, his face lit up. That's brilliant, he said. There's real need for it. I know at least 6 families within a day's ride who'd pay for proper teaching for their kids. You could stay based here at the ranch and ride out a few days a week. It would take time to build up, Lydia said, caught between excitement and practical concern. And I'd need books, teaching supplies, some way to assess what each child already knows. We'll figure it out, Caleb said firmly. If this is what you want, we'll make it work. His immediate support, his complete belief in her capability, made her throat tight with emotion. She'd spent so much of her life having to justify her choices, having to prove her competence, and here was a man who simply took her ability for granted and asked how he could help. I want to try, she said, but not until after... She stopped, suddenly uncertain. After Mason's trial, Caleb finished quietly. You'll need to testify. The trial was scheduled for mid-August in Helena, just over a month away. Lydia had been trying not to think about it, but the date loomed like a storm on the horizon. She'd have to stand up in court and recount every detail of those 3 days, face Mason across a courtroom, relive the worst experience of her life in front of strangers whose job was to pick apart her testimony, looking for inconsistencies. I'll go with you, Caleb said. You won't have to face him alone. I know, Lydia said. That's the only reason I think I can do it. July melted into early August. The days hot enough that they did the heaviest ranch work in the early mornings and late evenings, resting through the worst heat. Lydia's body changed with the physical labor. Her hands grew calloused, her arms stronger, her skin tanned despite her attempts to stay covered. She felt more solid somehow, more present in her body than she had in years of indoor teaching work. One evening, she caught Caleb watching her as she worked with one of the young horses, teaching it to accept a bridle. When she looked up and met his eyes, the expression on his face made her heart skip. It was admiration and desire and something deeper, something that looked like love, though neither of them had spoken the word yet. "What?" she asked, self-conscious under his gaze. "Nothing," he said. "Just thinking how well you fit here, like you were made for this life." "I'm not sure I was made for any particular life," Lydia said, stroking the horse's neck. "But I think maybe we make ourselves into what we need to be. I needed to be someone who could survive, so I survived. Now I need to be someone who can build a new life, so I'm learning how." "You're not just surviving anymore," Caleb observed. "You're thriving." She considered that. He was right. Somewhere in the past 2 months, survival had transformed into something richer. She woke up most mornings eager for the day rather than just grateful to have made it through the night. The nightmares that had plagued her first weeks at the ranch had faded to occasional disturbances rather than nightly terrors. She could think about the stagecoach robbery and the river without dissolving into panic. "I think you're right," she said, surprised by the realization. "I think I'm actually healing." "Good," Caleb said. "That's exactly what's supposed to happen." The summons for the trial arrived on a Wednesday, delivered by a territorial marshal who'd ridden out specifically to serve it. Lydia read the legal language with hands that only shook slightly, then folded the paper and tucked it in her pocket. "We'll leave day after tomorrow," Caleb said. "That gives us time to prepare and still get to Helena 2 days before the trial starts." "Will Eli be all right here alone?" Lydia asked. "Eli's been running this ranch by himself plenty of times," Caleb said. "He'll be fine. And Tom Barrett said he'd check in daily while we're gone." That night, Lydia couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning through everything she'd have to say in court, every question she might be asked, every way Mason's lawyer might try to discredit her testimony. Around midnight, she gave up on sleep and went to the kitchen for water. Caleb was there, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, a lamp burning low. He looked up when she entered and didn't seem surprised to see her. "Couldn't sleep either," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. She sat, accepting the coffee he poured for her, even though she didn't really want it. The warmth of the cup between her hands was soothing, regardless. "Tell me what you're afraid of," Caleb said. "That I'll freeze," Lydia admitted. "That I'll look at Mason and suddenly be back in that river, unable to speak or think or be anything except terrified. That my testimony won't be enough to convict him and he'll go free." "None of that will happen," Caleb said firmly. "First, you won't freeze because you're one of the strongest people I've ever met. You've already faced down the worst he could do and survived it. Facing him across a courtroom will be nothing compared to that. Second, I'll be right there with you. If you start to struggle, look at me. I'll be your anchor." "And if it's not enough?" Lydia asked. "If the jury doesn't believe me?" "Then he'll still hang based on the other charges," Caleb said. "There are 6 other counts of murder against him, witnesses to other crimes, a trail of evidence as long as my arm. Your testimony is important, but you're not carrying the entire case on your shoulders." The reassurance helped, though it didn't entirely banish her anxiety. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking coffee neither of them needed, the house quiet around them. "Caleb," Lydia said finally, "thank you for everything, for saving me, for giving me a place to heal, for being patient while I figured out how to be a person again." "You don't have to thank me," he said. "Loving you isn't something I do for gratitude." The word hung in the air between them, shocking in its simplicity. Lydia's breath caught, her heart suddenly racing. "You love me?" she whispered. Caleb met her eyes steadily. "Yes. I didn't mean to say it like that. Meant to wait until after the trial so you wouldn't feel pressured. But there it is. I love you, Lydia Carter. Have for weeks now. And you don't have to say it back." She stood and moved around the table, and before he could finish whatever he was going to say, she was kissing him. Not the careful, tentative kisses they'd shared before, but something deeper, something that carried everything she'd been too afraid to voice. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, she said, "I love you too. I think I have since you rode down from that ridge like something out of a story, and refused to let me die." His arms came around her, pulling her close, and she tucked her head against his shoulder and felt something fundamental settle into place. This was what home felt like. Not a place, but a person. Someone whose presence made her feel both safe and brave enough to face whatever came next. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the lamplit kitchen, while outside the Montana night stretched vast and starlit over a territory that had tried to break them both, but had instead given them each other. The journey to Helena took 3 days of steady riding through increasingly settled country. They passed homesteads and small settlements, saw more people in an hour than Lydia had seen in 2 months at the ranch. The proximity of so many strangers made her anxious at first, but Caleb's solid presence at her side helped her push through it. Helena itself was a shock after the isolation of the ranch. Streets crowded with wagons and horses, buildings 3 stories tall, the noise and bustle of territorial commerce. They took rooms at a modest boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Fletcher, who took one look at Lydia's nervous face and seemed to understand without explanation what brought them to town. "Trial witness?" she asked quietly as she showed them to their separate rooms. "Yes, ma'am," Caleb confirmed. "You'll do fine, dear," Mrs. Fletcher said to Lydia. "The judge is fair, and the prosecutor is good at his job. That Mason fellow will get what's coming to him." The day before the trial, Lydia met with the prosecutor, a sharp-eyed man named Alistair Green, who went over her testimony with methodical thoroughness. He warned her that Mason's defense attorney would try to rattle her, would suggest she was mistaken about details or motivated by revenge. "Just tell the truth exactly as you remember it," Green said. "Look at the jury when you speak, keep your voice steady, and remember that you're not on trial here. He is. You're the victim and the witness. You have nothing to be ashamed of or apologize for." That night, Caleb took her to dinner at one of Helena's better restaurants, trying to distract her from the next day's ordeal. They talked about anything except the trial, about the ranch, about Eli's latest escapade trying to break a particularly stubborn horse, about Lydia's plans for circuit teaching once this was all over. "Have you thought about where you want to be in 5 years?" Caleb asked over dessert. "I used to think I knew," Lydia said. "Before the stagecoach, I had it all planned out. Teach for 10 years, save money, maybe open my own school someday." "Now?" She met his eyes. "Now I think I'd like to be at the ranch, teaching the circuit, helping you and Eli build something lasting. Maybe," she hesitated, then pushed forward, "maybe building a family of our own." Caleb's hand found hers across the table. "I'd like that too," he said quietly. "All of it." The morning of the trial dawned clear and hot. Lydia, dressed in the nicest dress Mrs. Webb had given her, pinned her hair up with care, and tried to eat the breakfast Mrs. Fletcher insisted on providing. Her stomach was in knots, her hands shaking slightly, but when Caleb took her arm and they walked to the courthouse, his steady presence gave her courage. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and the curious. Mason sat at the defense table in clean clothes that made him look almost respectable, his face carefully neutral. When his eyes found Lydia, she saw recognition and something else. Not quite fear, but wariness. The look of a man who knew his fate hung in the balance. She didn't look away. She met his gaze steadily, letting him see that she wasn't the terrified woman he'd dragged toward the river. She'd survived him, had become stronger because of what he'd tried to do, and that strength would be what condemned him. The trial proceeded with formal efficiency. The prosecutor laid out the charges, the defense attorney argued precedent and reasonable doubt, and witnesses were called one by one. When Lydia's name was finally announced, she stood on legs that felt steadier than she'd expected and walked to the witness stand. The prosecutor led her through the testimony carefully: the stagecoach robbery, the murders she'd witnessed, the 3 days of captivity, the moment at the river when Caleb's bullet had cut her free. She kept her voice level, her eyes on the jury, telling the story without embellishment or drama, just the simple truth of what had happened. Mason's defense attorney rose for cross-examination, and Lydia braced herself. "Miss Carter," he began smoothly, "you've told us a very compelling story, But isn't it true that you were traumatized by these events? That your memory might be unreliable? My memory is perfectly clear, Lydia said firmly. I wish it weren't. I wish I could forget some of what I saw. But I remember every detail with terrible clarity. And yet you claim my client personally ordered your execution. Isn't it possible you misheard, that someone else gave that order? No, Lydia said. Garrett Mason looked directly at me and said, quote, "End of the line, sweetheart." Then he told his men to drown me, and let's move on. There was no misunderstanding. The attorney tried several more angles, but Lydia held firm, her testimony unwavering. After 30 minutes, he finally gave up and dismissed her. As she stepped down from the witness stand, she looked at Caleb sitting in the gallery and saw pride and love written plainly on his face. The trial lasted 3 more days, but the verdict was never really in doubt. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. The judge sentenced Mason to hang within the month, and as the marshal led him from the courtroom, he looked once more at Lydia. This time she didn't see wariness. She saw defeat, and the knowledge that justice had finally caught up with him. Outside the courthouse, Caleb pulled her into his arms, holding her tight while she shook with released tension and relief. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "It's finally over." "Not quite," Lydia said, pulling back to look at him. "There's still one more thing I need to do." She led him to the telegraph office and composed a message to Silver Creek School Board, thanking them for holding the position, but formally declining the offer. Her future, she'd realized, wasn't in a town she'd never seen teaching children she'd never met. Her future was at the Reeves Ranch, building a life with a man who'd saved her in every way a person could be saved. They left Helena the next morning, riding toward home with lighter hearts and the promise of a future finally, truly beginning. The Montana summer stretched golden and perfect around them, and for the first time since that terrible day on the road to Silver Creek, Lydia felt not just alive, but genuinely, completely free. The ride back to the ranch felt different from any journey Lydia had made before. The weight she'd been carrying since that terrible day on the stagecoach road had lifted, not completely. She suspected those scars would never fully disappear, but enough that she could breathe deeply and look at the horizon without fear shadowing every thought. Caleb rode beside her, his presence as steady as the mountains in the distance, and occasionally their eyes would meet and something would pass between them that needed no words. They stopped the first night at a creek where willows grew thick and the water ran clear over smooth stones. While Caleb tended the horses, Lydia walked to the water's edge and knelt, dipping her hands in the current. It was cold enough to make her gasp, and for a moment she was back in the Snake River with rope cutting her wrists and death pulling at her skirts. But then Caleb's hand touched her shoulder, grounding her in the present, and the memory released its grip. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she said, and meant it. "I was just thinking how strange it is that water tried to kill me, but now it's just water again, just a creek where we're camping for the night." "That's how healing works," Caleb said. "Things that hurt you stop having power over you. Takes time, but it happens." She stood and turned to face him, and in the fading light his features were shadowed and strong, his pale eyes reflecting the last of the sunset. Without planning it, without overthinking, she stepped into his arms and kissed him with an urgency she hadn't allowed herself before. He responded immediately, his arms coming around her, pulling her close, and for a long moment there was nothing but the two of them and the promise of everything they might build together. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said, the words simple and direct, no elaborate speech or careful planning. "Not today or tomorrow, but soon, whenever you're ready. I want to spend whatever years I have left making you happy, building a life with you, showing you every single day that you're loved and valued and safe." Lydia felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that came from overwhelming emotion rather than pain. "Yes," she said, "yes, I'll marry you. And I don't need a long engagement or a fancy wedding. I just need you and a preacher and the promise that we're in this together. Always together," Caleb promised, and kissed her again. They reached the ranch 2 days later to find Eli waiting on the porch, a grin splitting his face when he saw them riding in. "Well," he called as they dismounted, "how'd it go?" "Mason's going to hang," Caleb said. "Justice served." And more importantly, Lydia added, unable to keep the smile from her voice, your brother asked me to marry him. Eli whooped and jumped off the porch, grabbing them both in an enthusiastic embrace that nearly knocked all three of them over. About damn time! I was starting to think you two would dance around each other forever. He pulled back, looking between them with obvious joy. So when's the wedding? Soon, Lydia said. We haven't set a date yet, but soon. Good, Eli said. This place needs a woman's permanent touch, and I need someone to help me keep Caleb from being too serious all the time. They settled on a date 3 weeks away, long enough to make preparations, but not so long that the waiting became torture. Lydia wrote to Dr. and Mrs. Webb in Prospect, inviting them to attend. Caleb rode to Tom Barrett's ranch to spread word to the neighboring families. Eli took on the task of building a proper arch in the yard for the ceremony, spending his evenings sawing and hammering and cursing cheerfully when measurements didn't align. The days leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of activity. Mrs. Barrett arrived with 3 other ranch wives to help Lydia make her dress, bringing fabric they'd been saving for something special. The women worked together in the ranch house parlor, their needles flashing in the lamplight, their conversation easy and welcoming. They asked Lydia about her teaching plans, about her life before Montana, about how she and Caleb had met. She told them a carefully edited version of the story, leaving out the worst details but keeping the essential truth, that he'd saved her life and stolen her heart in the process. He's a good man, said Emma Barrett, Tom's wife, a capable woman in her 40s with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes. Helped us out more times than I can count, never asking for anything in return. You're lucky to have found each other. I know, Lydia said, watching her hands work the delicate fabric. The dress was taking shape beautifully, simple but elegant, with lace at the collar and cuffs that Mrs. Webb had sent from Prospect. Sometimes I think about how easily it could have gone differently. If Caleb had been an hour later reaching that river, if his aim hadn't been perfect, if any of a dozen things had changed, but they didn't, interrupted Sarah Mitchell, the youngest of the ranch wives at barely 25. That's what matters. You can drive yourself crazy thinking about what might have been. Better to be grateful for what is. The wisdom in those simple words struck Lydia deeply. She'd spent too much time dwelling on the trauma, not enough celebrating the fact that she'd survived it and found something precious on the other side. Caleb, meanwhile, was dealing with his own preparations. He rode into Helena and returned with a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother, carefully preserved in a box with his parents' other treasured possessions. He showed it to Lydia in the privacy of the barn one evening, the metal gleaming softly in the lamplight. My father gave this to my mother when they married, he said. She wore it every day until she died. I know it's not new, not something I picked out specifically for you, but it's perfect, Lydia interrupted, taking the ring gently. It means something. It has history and love woven into it. I couldn't ask for anything better. He visibly relaxed. I was worried you'd want something fancier. I don't need fancy, Lydia said. I need real and honest and true. That's what this is. The night before the wedding, the ranch wives insisted on taking Lydia to the Barrett Ranch for a small celebration, leaving the men to their own devices. They fed her well, shared stories of their own courtships and marriages, and gave her advice that ranged from practical to scandalous. Lydia laughed until her sides hurt, feeling welcomed into a community she hadn't known she was joining. One thing you should know about ranch life, Emma Barrett said as the evening wound down. It's hard, brutal sometimes. The weather doesn't care about your plans, the cattle don't respect your schedule, and there will be days when you wonder why you didn't just stay in civilization. But there's also a freedom here that you can't find anywhere else. A sense of building something with your own hands, of living by your own choices. And when you've got a good man beside you, someone who will work as hard as you do and love you just as fiercely, well, that makes all the difference. Caleb's a good man, Lydia said softly. The best, Emma agreed, which is why we're all so glad he found you. He's been alone too long carrying too much weight by himself. You'll lighten that load, and he'll do the same for you. That's what marriage is supposed to be. Two people making each other's burdens easier to bear. But Lydia thought about those words as she lay in the Barrett's guest room that night, unable to sleep from excitement and anticipation. Tomorrow she would marry Caleb Reeves, would bind her life to his in front of God and community, would choose deliberately and consciously to build a future with him. The girl who'd boarded a stagecoach in Fort Benton 3 months ago would never have imagined this outcome. But the woman she'd become through fire and fear and ultimately love knew with absolute certainty that this was right. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, the sky that particular shade of blue that seemed to exist only in Montana. Lydia dressed with Mrs. Barrett's help, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened the buttons on her new dress. The fabric was cream-colored cotton, simple but well made, and when she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw someone she barely recognized, stronger than before, marked by experience but not broken by it, ready to step into a new chapter with clear eyes and an open heart. The ceremony was held in the yard beneath Eli's carefully constructed arch, which he'd decorated with wildflowers that morning. About 30 people had gathered, neighboring ranchers and their families, Dr. and Mrs. Webb from Prospect, Marshall Bridger from Helena, who'd made the journey specifically to attend. Even Tom Barrett's ranch hands had showed up, dressed in their best shirts, standing at the back and grinning. Caleb stood waiting beneath the arch, and when Lydia emerged from the house on Eli's arm, the younger brother having insisted on giving her away, she saw Caleb's expression shift into something that made her breath catch. It was awe and love and gratitude all mixed together, the look of a man who couldn't quite believe his good fortune. The circuit preacher, Reverend Walsh, kept the ceremony blessedly brief. He spoke about commitment and partnership, about building a life on faith and trust, about the sacred bond between two people who chose each other freely. When it came time for vows, Caleb spoke first, his voice steady and clear. "Lydia, I promise to love you and protect you, to work beside you and support your dreams, to be honest even when it's hard and patient when you need time. I promise to make you laugh when I can and hold you when you cry. I promise to be worthy of the trust you've placed in me, every single day for the rest of my life." Lydia's own vows came from somewhere deep inside, words she hadn't planned but that felt completely true. "Caleb, I promise to love you with everything I am, to build a life with you that honors what we've both survived and celebrates what we've found together. I promise to be your partner in all things, to challenge you when you need it and support you always. I promise to make our house a home and our life an adventure worth living." Reverend Walsh blessed the union, and when he pronounced them married, Caleb kissed her with a gentleness that somehow conveyed more passion than any dramatic gesture could have. The gathered crowd cheered, and someone, probably one of Tom Barrett's ranch hands, fired a pistol in the air in celebration. The rest of the day passed in a blur of joy. Tables had been set up in the yard laden with food the ranch wives had prepared. There was music courtesy of a fiddle player from one of the neighboring ranches, and dancing that went on until the stars came out. Eli made a toast that was equal parts sentimental and teasing, thanking Lydia for civilizing his brother and promising to be the best brother-in-law in the territory. Dr. Webb pulled Caleb aside for a quiet conversation that ended with the older man clapping him on the shoulder and nodding approval. As evening fell and the celebration continued around them, Caleb and Lydia slipped away from the crowd and walked to the ridge overlooking the valley. The land stretched away in all directions, darkening now as sunset faded to twilight, dotted with the lights of neighboring ranches and the stars beginning their nightly appearance. "How are you feeling?" Caleb asked, his arm around her waist. "Happy," Lydia said simply. "Genuinely, completely happy. I didn't think I'd feel this way again, not after everything that happened. But here I am, married to you, surrounded by good people, looking at a future I actually want to live." "We're going to build something good here," Caleb said. "Better than good. Something extraordinary. You with your teaching, me helping Tom and working our own ranch, Eli finally having someone to talk to besides me and the horses. A real life, not just surviving, but thriving." "Speaking of teaching," Lydia said, "I got a letter yesterday from the Henderson family. Remember, the ones who left after their homestead burned? They're coming back next spring with 3 other families from back east. They want to know if I'll teach their children when they arrive." "That's wonderful," Caleb said. "So it's really happening, your circuit teaching?" "It's really happening," Lydia confirmed. "I'm going to start with the Barrett children next week, just to practice and refine my approach. Then as word spreads, I'll add more families. Emma thinks within a year I could be teaching 20 or 30 children across the territory." "You'll be amazing at it," Caleb said with complete confidence. You've got a gift for explaining things clearly, for making people feel capable and valued. Those kids will be lucky to have you. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last light fade from the western sky. Finally, Lydia said, I should go back to the Snake River. Caleb turned to look at her, surprise and concern crossing his face. What? Why? Because I need to see it again, Lydia explained. Not running from it or being dragged toward it, but choosing to go there on my own terms. I need to stand on that bank and remember what happened and know that it doesn't have power over me anymore. Does that make sense? Perfect sense, Caleb said, though worry still shadowed his eyes. When do you want to go? Not today, Lydia said. Today is for celebrating, but soon, maybe next week before I start teaching. One last confrontation with the past before I fully step into the future. I'll take you, Caleb said. We'll go together. They returned to the celebration hand in hand, and the party continued well into the night. When it finally wound down and the last guest had departed, when Eli had diplomatically announced he'd be sleeping in the barn to give them privacy, Caleb and Lydia found themselves alone in the ranch house that was now truly their home together. They climbed the stairs to the room they'd share from this night forward, both suddenly shy despite everything they'd already been through together. But when Caleb took her hand and led her inside, when he kissed her with all the love and desire he'd been holding in check for months, the shyness faded into something beautiful and right. They came together as husband and wife, two people who'd been broken and rebuilt, finding healing and joy in each other's arms. The week that followed established new rhythms. Lydia began preparing for her teaching work, organizing books, and creating lesson plans. Caleb helped Tom Barrett with a fence project that had been languishing, and in the evenings they'd all gather for dinner that felt like family. Eli, true to his word, seemed delighted to have Lydia as a permanent resident, and his easy laughter filled the house in ways it hadn't before. On a Tuesday morning when the weather was fine and the ranch work wasn't pressing, Caleb and Lydia rode north toward the Snake River. Neither spoke much during the journey, each lost in their own thoughts. When they finally reached the section of river where everything had happened, Lydia's breath caught despite her preparation. The place looked different in daylight, without terror coloring her perception. The water still ran fast and white over the rocks, but it was just a river, powerful and potentially dangerous, but not malevolent. The sandbank where Mason had stood smoking while his men dragged her toward death was just a curve in the shore. The cottonwood where Caleb had tied the outlaws was just a tree. She dismounted and walked to the water's edge, Caleb staying close but not hovering. The current pulled at the toes of her boots when she got near enough, cold and insistent. "This is where you were," she said, pointing to a spot on the ridge. "And I was here, in the water, thinking I was about to die." "But you didn't die," Caleb said quietly. "You fought, and I got lucky with my shot, and you survived." "We survived," Lydia corrected. She bent and picked up a smooth river stone, turning it over in her hands. "I want to leave something here, something that marks the moment my life changed." She walked a few yards upstream to a flat section of bank and carefully placed the stone on a natural shelf in the rock. Using a smaller stone, she scratched words into the larger one. Lydia Carter Reeves lived. Caleb came to stand beside her, looking at her handiwork. "Simple but powerful," he said. "That's all that matters in the end," Lydia said. "Not the trauma or the fear or even the rescue, just the fact that I'm here, I'm alive, and I'm choosing how my story continues." They stood together looking at the river for a few more minutes, and Lydia felt something inside her shift and settle. The nightmares would probably never completely stop, and she'd carry the scars, both visible and invisible, for the rest of her life. But they didn't define her anymore. They were just part of a larger story that included love and purpose and a future bright with possibility. "Ready to go home?" Caleb asked. "Yes," Lydia said, taking his hand. "Let's go home." The ride back to the ranch was lighter somehow, as if exorcising that particular demon had freed up space for other things. They talked about their plans for the winter, about whether to expand the cattle herd or focus on improving the existing stock, about how many children they hoped to have someday and what they'd name them. "At least 3, Lydia said. "I was an only child and it was lonely. I want our children to have siblings, to grow up with built-in friends and allies." 3 sounds good, Caleb agreed, though knowing our luck, we'll end up with 6. I could live with 6, Lydia said with a smile, as long as at least one of them is a girl, someone I can teach to read poetry and ride horses and be fierce in the world. They'll all be fierce if they take after you, Caleb said. Life settled into patterns after that, the kind of comfortable routine that makes days blur together in the best possible way. Lydia began her circuit teaching, riding out 3 days a week to various ranches where eager children waited to learn their letters and numbers. She discovered a talent for making education engaging even in difficult circumstances, teaching mathematics through ranch problems like calculating cattle weights, and geometry through building projects. The children loved her, and their parents praised her methods and insisted on paying more than she'd asked. Caleb, true to his word, gave up bounty hunting entirely. He took on more work helping neighboring ranchers, building his reputation as someone reliable and skilled. The money was steadier if less dramatic than bounty hunting had provided, and he came home every night without bullet holes or knife wounds, which Lydia appreciated immensely. Eli thrived with both his brother and sister-in-law present, his natural sociability finding full expression. He courted Sarah Mitchell, the young ranch wife who'd helped make Lydia's wedding dress, and by Christmas had proposed. The wedding was planned for spring, and Eli joked that now all 3 Reeves household residents would be married, which seemed only fair. Winter came hard that year, bringing snowstorms that buried the valley under 3 feet of white and temperatures that made stepping outside feel like being stabbed with ice. But the ranch house stayed warm, the cattle survived in the sheltered valleys where they'd been moved, and the Reeves family, now expanded to include Lydia, weathered the season with stories and books, and Eli's increasingly skilled cooking. It was during that long winter, when Lydia was wrapped in quilts by the fire reading aloud from Dickens while snow howled outside, that she realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but had wanted to be certain before saying anything. When she finally told Caleb, his face lit up with a joy so pure it made her eyes water. "We're going to have a baby," he said, as if testing the words. "We're going to have a baby," Lydia confirmed. He pulled her into his arms, careful and gentle already. "I'm going to be a father," he murmured into her hair. "I'm going to teach our child to ride and read and be decent in the world. I'm going to make sure they know they're loved every single day." "You're going to be a wonderful father," Lydia said. "The best kind, patient and strong and full of quiet wisdom." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the remainder of winter and into spring. Lydia continued teaching until she was too uncomfortable to ride long distances, then began holding lessons at the ranch house for nearby families. Emma Barrett and the other ranch wives descended regularly with advice and supplies, and the kind of practical knowledge that can't be found in books. Eli's wedding to Sarah Mitchell happened on a perfect April morning, and Lydia stood beside Caleb watching his brother marry with the same simple joy that had marked their own ceremony. The territory felt less wild now, more settled, as if something fundamental was shifting. More families were arriving, more ranches being established, the beginnings of real community taking root in soil that had once seemed too harsh to sustain anything but the hardiest pioneers. Lydia went into labor on a hot August night, exactly 1 year after Mason's trial. The symmetry wasn't lost on her. On the anniversary of closing one chapter, she was opening another. The birth was hard, longer and more painful than she'd anticipated. But when dawn broke and their daughter finally arrived, squalling and red-faced and absolutely perfect, Lydia forgot every moment of suffering. "She's beautiful," Caleb whispered, cradling the tiny bundle with hands that had shot outlaws and built barns, but were infinitely gentle with this fragile new life. "She's perfect. What should we name her?" Lydia had been thinking about this for months. "Grace," she said, "Grace Elizabeth Reeves, because grace is what saved me. Your grace in pulling me from the river, God's grace in letting me survive, the grace of second chances and new beginnings." "Grace," Caleb repeated, and smiled. "Perfect." The years that followed were full and rich and occasionally difficult, as all good lives are. Lydia taught several dozen children across the territory, watching them grow from barely literate to reading Shakespeare alongside practical textbooks. Caleb and Eli expanded the ranch, bringing in better breeding stock and implementing new techniques they learned from agricultural journals. Grace grew into a bright, curious child who learned to ride almost before she could walk and showed signs of inheriting both her mother's love of learning and her father's quiet strength. Two more children followed, a son they named Joshua after Caleb's murdered friend, and another daughter called Emma after Mrs. Barrett, who'd helped Lydia so much in those early days. The ranch house rang with children's laughter and the organized chaos of a growing family. Eli and Sarah added their own children to the mix, living in a house Caleb helped them build on the northern section of the property, and the cousins grew up more like siblings, running wild through the valley and learning the land that was their inheritance. On Grace's 5th birthday, Lydia and Caleb took her to the Snake River. The child had heard simplified versions of the story that her mother had been in danger and her father had saved her. But now Lydia wanted her daughter to see the actual place, to understand that beautiful things can come from terrible beginnings. They stood on the bank where Lydia had once been dragged toward death, and Grace asked questions with the directness of childhood. "Were you scared, Mama?" "Very scared," Lydia said honestly. "More scared than I'd ever been." "But Papa's saved you," Grace said with absolute confidence. "He did," Lydia agreed, looking at Caleb over their daughter's head. "And then we saved each other in all the ways that matter." The stone Lydia had marked years before was still there, the words she'd scratched into it worn but legible. Lydia Carter Reeves lived. Grace traced the letters with her small finger, sounding out the words. "That's your name, Mama." "It is," Lydia said. "I put it here to remember that no matter how bad things get, we can survive them. We can come back stronger and build lives worth living." They planted wildflower seeds on the bank before leaving, Grace carefully patting dirt over them with her small hands. By next summer they'd bloom, bringing beauty to a place that had once held only terror. It seemed fitting somehow, the ultimate reclamation, turning a site of near death into something that celebrated life. As the years passed and Lydia's hair began to show threads of silver, as Caleb's face gained more lines and their children grew toward adulthood, she sometimes thought about that girl who'd boarded a stagecoach in Fort Benton with nothing but hope and a teaching certificate. She thought about how that girl had nearly died, had been dragged toward a river that wanted to swallow her, had looked up to see a man on horseback descending like salvation itself. She thought about how terror and trauma had tried to define her, had nearly succeeded, but how she'd fought her way free with Caleb's help and the stubborn refusal to let violence have the final word. She thought about grace, the grace of being saved, the grace of saving herself, the grace of building something good from wreckage. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Caleb and Lydia stood on the porch of their ranch house as the sun set over the valley. Their children were inside with the grandchildren that had started arriving, Grace's twin boys, Joshua's daughter, Emma's son. The house was full of noise and life and the beautiful chaos of family. "Happy?" Caleb asked, his arm around her waist, his hair more gray than brown now, but his eyes still that same pale blue that had looked at her with such determination when he'd pulled her from the river. "More than I ever thought possible," Lydia said. "There were days early on when I couldn't imagine feeling anything but afraid, when survival seemed like the best I could hope for. But look at what we built." "We built it together," Caleb said. "Everything good in my life started the day I rode down that ridge and saw you in that river. Pulling you out pulled me out too, in a way. Gave me purpose beyond just hunting bad men. Gave me a reason to build instead of just chase." "The river tried to take me," Lydia said, echoing words she'd spoken before. "But you wouldn't let it." "Thank God for that," Caleb said, pulling her close. "Because these 20 years with you have been the best of my life." Inside, they could hear Grace's voice raised in laughter. Eli telling one of his stories that somehow got more elaborate with each retelling. Sarah shushing the children before bedtime. The ordinary sounds of a family loving each other. Outside, the Montana night settled over the valley, stars emerging one by one in the darkening sky. And somewhere far to the north, the Snake River ran on as it always had, powerful and dangerous and beautiful. Witness to death and salvation. And the moment when two lives had collided and changed forever. Lydia had survived the river, had built a life on the other side of trauma that was rich and full and exactly what she'd needed even when she hadn't known to want it. She'd loved and been loved, had taught and learned, had raised children and helped build community in a territory that was finally becoming something more than just wilderness and violence. The story that began with terror and a rifle shot had become something else entirely: a love story, a survival story, a testament to the human capacity for healing and hope. And standing on her porch, with her husband's arm around her and her family's laughter filling the air, Lydia understood with crystal clarity that this was the best ending she could have possibly written, not just surviving, but truly, deeply, joyfully living. The river had tried to take her, but she had refused to be taken. And in refusing, she had claimed everything beautiful that followed: the man, the family, the life, the love. All of it earned, all of it chosen, all of it hers. The story was complete, the circle closed, the journey from that terrible day to this perfect moment finally, fully traveled. And it was good. It was also very, very good.